Welcome, traveler of the unknown seas. Tonight, we unfold an ancient chronicle woven not with ink, but with silence. It is a tale of ships that set sail beneath bright skies yet never reached their harbors, of treasure fleets swallowed, without a trace, of phantom islands shimmering on the horizon, and of drowned cities whose bells still toll beneath the waves. This is not mere history, nor myth alone. It is the eternal hymn of the ocean, the hush that remembers every vanished name. Sit close. Let the tide of words carry you. Step into a story where empires vanish, fleets dissolve, and silence itself becomes the voice of the sea. Here, in the hush of the deep, you will discover that nothing is ever truly lost. It's only remembered by the waters forever. Asterisk, in the earliest dawn of human memory, when myth and history were not yet divided, the sea was both pathway and predator. It offered pearls, fish, salt, and the shimmering road to far horizons. Yet it also devoured without warning, keeping for itself whole ships, whole fleets, whole peoples who vanished into its unfathomable depths. The ocean was a gift, but it was also a mouth. The Phoenicians, first great masters of navigation, told of waters where the stars dimmed, where the horizon twisted, and where galleys slipped into circles without end. They marked their charts with caution, leaving wide spaces unnamed, scrawled only with words that meant beware. Mariners whispered of gulfs where invisible hands seized the rudder, of currents that spun endlessly, of ghostly lights hovering above the waves. Those who went too far did not return. The Egyptians, too, feared the open sea. They carved warnings on temple walls, naming it the eternal blue, a realm beyond the Nile's safe embrace. Priests said that there the god Sobek lurked, hungry for more than flesh, a devourer of wood, canvas, and the souls of sailors. When royal ships failed to return, the people declared that Sobek had claimed his tribute. The Greeks sang of it in their myths. Beyond the Pillars of Hercules stretched an ocean unmeasured, an expanse the poets called the endless. Their storms came unbidden, currents circled like serpents, and whole expeditions vanished into the twilight. Sailors swore they saw phantom fleets drifting across the night sky, their sails glowing faintly as though lit by moonfire. These were said to be the shadows of vessels lost forever, condemned to sail between stars. Even the pragmatic Romans, who conquered with iron and road, could not deny the sea's mysteries. Their chronicles tell of triremes bound from Tingis to Hispania that never arrived, of grain ships destined for Rome that dissolved into absence. The bureaucrats of empire, reluctant to speak of curses, wrote only two words beside such entries: incertum, est, unknown. Through the long centuries of the Middle Ages, fear clothed the sea in darker robes. Pilgrims bound for the Holy Land sometimes never reached their destination. Monks recorded entire fleets vanishing between ports, not by storm or by sword, but by silence. In Segelhorst, a merchant fleet left the Weser River with gold and goods. The chronicles tell of calm weather. No raiders, no wreckage. Days became weeks, yet none returned. The story entered the monastery annals, not as battle or martyrdom, but as mystery. From that day, the name Segelhorst bore the shadow of disappearance. The north, in the cold fog of the Baltic, fishermen spoke of the White Road, a shifting path of pale water glimpsed in the mist. Boats that strayed into it did not return, even when skies were clear and winds kind. In stone cloisters, monks prayed for souls who had vanished thus, recording the names of ships that had no graves. Their candles burned in memory, though no wreckage was ever found. When the age of discovery dawned, the riddle deepened. The Portuguese and Spanish sent caravels westward, their sails taut with ambition. The Atlantic received them with deceptive calm. Columbus himself wrote of strange lights dancing on the horizon, of compasses that wavered as though drawn by unseen forces. He pressed on, but many who followed him did not. The sea between Europe, Africa, and the New World soon became known as a place of vanishing. Storms struck from empty skies. Ships were found derelict, their crews gone. From this region, men later carved a name that endures still, the Bermuda Triangle. But the legend was older than the name, older than the maps, older than the nations that claimed the sea as theirs. Spanish galleons heavy with gold, Dutch ships swollen with spices, Portuguese carracks bearing silk and porcelain. Some reached port in triumph, but many dissolved into rumor. Families in Lisbon and Seville waited in vain for ships that had left months before, their fates written not in stone or parchment, but in silence. Insurance clerks wrote, "Lost at sea." Widows whispered of curses, sailors told of the singing. Wind, a current of air that carried a sound like music. Entire crews, enchanted, followed it unknowingly until the stars disappeared. The sea turned gray, and the ship was swallowed by mist. Others spoke of ghost fleets, silhouettes of tall masts gliding across the moonlit horizon, never drawing near, never making a sound. They were said to be the shadows of lost ships, doomed to sail eternally between one shore and none, in the Mediterranean. Islands appeared on maps only to vanish later as though they had been bait. Genoese charts of the 13th century record one such isle where a fleet landed and never returned. Thereafter, the island itself vanished from cartography, as if the sea had erased not only the men but the ground beneath their feet. In the Baltic, the Hanseatic League lost entire convoys, without explanation. The ledger books mark them with the terse phrase, "Novice period, the ship is gone." The ocean does not always kill by storm or hunger. Sometimes it kills by silence. The Renaissance gave mankind new sails, stronger hulls, and charts inked with confidence, yet the ocean yielded to none of these with certainty. The more men explored, the deeper grew the ledger of those who never returned. In Lisbon, the harbors bustled with masts pointing like a forest of spears to the sky. Ships departed for Guinea, for India, for the New World. Some returned swollen with riches, their holds bursting with spices, ivory, and gold. Yet for each that returned, whispers spoke of others that did not. Families pressed their faces too, the sea walls scanning the horizon long after the appointed time, only to hear the cruel words, "The ship is lost." But often there was no storm to blame, no pirate's attack to curse, no plank or sail drifting back as a token.
Oh.
There was only absence. The Portuguese caravels, nimble and daring, pushed further into the Atlantic than any had dared before. They named islands, marked reefs, and pressed on toward horizons no man had yet crossed. Some ships returned with tales of discovery, others dissolved into myth. Mariners spoke of fogs that came without warning, thick and heavy as wool, that swallowed a fleet whole. Men who had seen such fog swore they felt the sea change beneath them, as if the water itself became unsteady, no longer true. Those who entered seldom returned. Spanish galleons fared no better. Their hulls were fortresses, their decks guarded with cannon, yet the sea did not need fire or steel to claim them. The treasure fleets, heavy with gold from the Americas, set out in glittering procession, only to vanish between Havana and Seville. At first storms were blamed, but storms left wreckage, and the sea returned none. There were whole convoys whose names lived only in the prayers of widows. In the records of the Casa de Contratación, the Royal Office of Trade, one finds cold notations, "Fleet departed." "Fleet not seen again." The Dutch, masters of spice and commerce, told the same tales. From Batavia they sailed, their ships pregnant, with cloves and nutmeg, bound for Amsterdam. Some made the voyage, some did not. The Indian Ocean, no gentler than the Atlantic, swallowed merchantmen and left not even the courtesy of driftwood. Sailors whispered of whirlpools invisible in the air, calm of stars that twisted overhead, guiding them astray. Even the most practical captains confessed unease, and their compasses spun, or their watches ran strangely slow. The French and English, eager to join the banquet of empire, soon tasted the same mystery. Colonies were planted, forts were raised, but ships sent to supply them sometimes never arrived. Letters of charter spoke confidently of vessels on their way. Months later, silence reigned. At home, officials whispered of storms, mutiny, or piracy, but those explanations dulled with repetition. The deeper truth was that the sea itself was writing its own chronicle, in which whole crews were erased like lines in sand. And all the while, tales grew of phantom islands, marked on maps by explorers, visited once and never seen again. The Isle of San Borondon, the Isle of Brazil, Antillia names etched in ink, reported by captains of good standing then. Gone. Some said these islands lured ships to their shores only to drag them beneath the waves. Others swore the islands themselves were mirages conjured by the sea, traps of salt and shadow. Whatever the truth, ships that sought them often disappeared, leaving only the island's name as a haunting echo. In northern waters, fishermen sang of the silent shoals. Boats drifted together as if bound by some unseen rope. Their crews vanished, though their nets were stowed and their decks in order. The boats themselves drifted back to shore like hollow bones. Priests declared it the hand of God, sailors muttered. Of older powers, nameless and hungry, by the 17th century, as the seas grew busier, so too did the toll of vanishings. There were vessels found adrift with sails full and cargo intact, but not a soul aboard, there were convoys reported, leaving port that never arrived at their destination, and no trace of them was ever found. The more ships filled the seas, the more the sea seemed to claim for itself. It was during these centuries that the legend of the wandering fleet began to take shape. Sailors in the South Atlantic told of seeing a procession of ships on the horizon, their sails tattered, their decks silent, moving against the wind. No matter how one steered, the ghostly fleet never drew nearer, never fell astern. They drifted as if in another world, crossing the path of the living but belonging to none. Some said they were the souls of ships lost without explanation, condemned to wander the seas forever. And so the sea's reputation grew not only as a highway of wealth, but as a graveyard without stones. For each discovery recorded in ink, another absence was recorded in silence. The chronicles of disappearance threaded themselves through every port, every fleet, every empire. No nation was spared, for the sea belonged to none and owed no one an answer. Thus the ocean, in all its vastness, became both map and mystery, both cradle of nations and devourer of men. Its waves bore the laughter of sailors and the laments of widows, and its depths kept secrets older than the names of gods. And as the 17th century waned, the vanishings did not lessen, rather they grew more frequent, as though the sea itself had awakened to claim its tithe. Whole eras might change, kings might fall, and empires rise. But the sea's ledger remained open, filled not with the words of men, but with their absence. The age of empire marched forward, yet the sea remained older, wiser, unpersuaded by flags or decrees. Kings could redraw borders, merchants could rewrite contracts, but none could amend the ocean's grammar. Its clauses were currents, its punctuation, storms, its meaning forever withheld. In those years, ports learned to read silences as carefully as letters. A convoy that should have been sighted by a certain moon did not come. Pilot lantern that should have flickered on a headland was not answered from the water. Harbor masters kept ledgers where the entries for wheat, wine, timber, and spice were balanced by a margin of absence, the neat arithmetic of trade offset by the untidy calculus of loss. When messengers arrived breathless with rumors, the rumors had edges, calm seas, fair winds, instruments in order as far as anyone knew, and then nothing. Sailors less shy than priests about naming what they feared began to speak of lines drawn upon the water that no cartographer could fix. There were belts of ocean that looked identical to any other patch of blue, and yet carried a different temperament. A lull within motion, a quiet within noise, a gentle cloth laid over the senses. Ships that drifted into these belts often lost. More than speed, they lost coherence. Courses wandered, watches lengthened and shortened without agreement, and the sky's familiar stories Orion. The bare, the steadfast pole seemed to step a fraction aside from where they must be. Such fractions do not alarm landsmen. At sea, a fraction is destiny. In northern Europe, the Hanseatic towns, proud and precise, came to accept an unwelcome refrain. Barges gone missing on inland reaches, cogs vanishing between river mouth and open sea. The Vaser, whose moods were well known, acquired a rumor older than its tides. From Segelhorst downward, men spoke of a reach of water that hummed faintly in the bones. Warehouses were built with extra stalls for the goods that would not be claimed. Wives learned to keep a candle ready regardless of weather, for weather was not the culprit that stalked those waters. A priest who had no patience for superstition wrote in his register, after a list of names, a simple addition, and the river gave no answer. He wrote it once, then again, until the phrase hardened into custom. Far to the west, the mid-ocean took on the sermon voice of myth. Navigators who trusted the instruments of their age learned a kind of humility that belonged to older centuries. They told of a mile-wide skin upon the sea that sounded hollow when struck with an oar, of birds that circled once and then fled as if rebuked, of a fragrance of metal on fair days. They told of a tide that pushed not toward any shore but toward a point that was not a point, a center that could not be reached. Those who attempted to tack free felt their ships obedient underhand and yet watched hour by hour as the horizon refused to change. There were other signs, lanterns that burned clean and then guttered at noon, compasses that kept faith all morning and then leaned a whisper toward mischief, soundings that returned to smooth, meaningless depth where charts promised ridges. Most unnerving of all were the sightings. On brisk nights with stars walking their ancient measure, a watchman would cry out a masthead lamp far off, a line of sail, a convoy perhaps. The helmsman would answer with a signal, but the far lamp would not reply. The other hulls would neither near nor recede, and by dawn there would be only air, the shape of expectation torn away. The crew left with a story that no magistrate would file. Mariners of the south spoke more quietly. In the Indian Ocean, where islands are beads upon an unseen string, pilots learned to count their passes by smell as much as sight clove. Cinnamon, the pepper temps that tells of rain, a day distant. They also learned to distrust stretches of air where smell failed, where the wind went smooth and the water glassed over. There even experienced men found their notions thinning. Courses were rechecked not because of error felt, but because of error feared. And sometimes, while all was proper the stars true, the drift account of days would pass as if the ship were walking in place. It is not speed alone that feeds a crew's courage. It is the sense of progress. When that sense is withdrawn without visible cause, courage eats itself. On calmer seas nearer home, derelicts began to be reported with a frequency that left a taste of iron in every maritime court. A brig found with its canvas trimmed, the deck swabbed, cook fires recently out. Ledgers open to a day's routine, and no men. A caravel met in mid-ocean, answering no hail, her bell sounding with the sea's rise and fall. Boarding revealed. Order undisturbed, cups upright, a rosary coiled upon a bunk. What accident empties a vessel and leaves her unrebuked by weather? Storms toss, fire blackens, hunger strews. But these decks held tidiness like accusation. No honest hypothesis could bear the weight of such neatness. The sea had returned the shell and taken the creature in the great empire's counting houses. Explanations were marshaled and drilled. Tempest, lee shore, rot, worm, negligent seamanship. Predation by corsairs who knew how to hide their trail. Each of these carried truth in it, as any rope is comprised of many strands. Yet in corridor talk, among men who had read too many depositions, a different recognition gathered. The ocean's appetite included forms of taking that left no ledger entry to dispute. The absence itself had character, to those forced to stare. It in the face, it felt deliberate, not by a mind perhaps, but by a law older than minds. In taverns and forecastles, older words served where new ones failed. There were roads across water that men entered as they might a court once within. They obeyed protocols they could not name. There were doors that opened on windless days, audible to the ear in a change of tension, visible to the eye in the angle of a far cloud. A ship might pass one such door 10 times in a career and think it only weather. On the 11th she would step through, and her name would become a prayer. Even the modest coasts kept their private liturgies. A hamlet that faced north upon knife-bright water, there hung a board in the chapel with pegs cut for votive ships. When a man went out, His wife placed a small wooden hole upon a peg. He returned. She removed it. The oldest women knew, to leave one peg empty. That is for the vessel that comes home without her crew, they said. And once in a generation, a boat would indeed wash in oars, shipped, nets coiled, kettle swung. 2 hook and only goals to greet it. The appointed peg was not superstition. It was memory-given furniture. As for the maps, they swelled with details and then contracted in embarrassment. Not a lit, confirmed by 3 captains, fell away after a generation of skepticism. A bank that should have lifted the sea to a different color proved to be a trick of light. Yet the cartographers, no less than sailors, kept a private column for phenomena that recurred, a haze in such and such latitude when the moon was old, a hum in the stays that ceased the instant a course was altered by a hand's breadth, an odd obedience of the C2 metal dropped overboard, as if sounding line and lead were saluted and then ignored. Margins that once carried dragons now carried nothing. But the nothing had a reputation. On certain coasts, the bells of churches were trained by sorrow to a new vocabulary. 1 toll for storm loss, 2 for battle, 3 for fever at sea, 4. A vessel vanished in fair conditions. The sexton pulled the rope in silence and let the bell speak as it would. The note that answered was lower, thicker, as if drawn through water. Men and women who heard it did not ask which ship. They asked, with a practical kindness, which houses would need bread. As centuries turned, the sea's habit did not. For every generation that learned a new instrument, the ocean conjured an old perplexity. It is fitting that the words most often found beside the names of ships undone by silence belong to the family of unknowing, missing, presumed, unaccounted. They are not defects in record-keeping. They are acknowledgments of a power that writes its own minutes beneath miles of salt. Yet the chronicles are not pure despair. The sea, as if to keep faith with the living, sometimes yields a token, spar, with a mark recognizably carved by a sailor's knife, cask stamped with a merchant's seal, its contents long married to brine. A chest of tools flung upon a strand, each wrapped against rust by hands that intended to use them again. Such fragments are not explanations, they are relics. Families handle them with the reverence given to saints' bones. The state inventories them. Between those 2 gestures lies the whole difference between grief and governance. In the telling of these matters, the old telling, the one that refuses embroidery certain patterns, insist. The sea does not need to rage to erase, it can act. In sunshine, it does not need conspirators to take from a ship what makes her a community. It can leave the furniture of life intact and lift only the life. And while men are quick to draw triangles upon a map, to put rulers to rumor, the ocean ignores geometry. Its angles are weather, its lines are pressure, its proofs are written in tides, so the tale flows on as the wake of a vessel widens and then is gone. A child on a quay once asked an elder why the water remembers nothing, why the path of a ship is erased behind it. The elder, who had not put to sea in many winters, answered slowly that the water remembers perfectly, but not in a language we can read. He touched the child's forehead and said, "What we call forgetting is the sea keeping its counsel." The horizon lowers. The sky carries that shy green which sailors watch with narrow eyes. Far off, a smear of gray suggests nothing in particular and everything at once. The crew goes about its business with the economy of men who have made a truce with distance. The logbook waits for ink. The bell waits for the hour. On some future shore, a woman will raise her head because the silence in the lane is shaped. Like loss, she will not know yet that this ship, this very one, has passed from measure to mystery. But the sea knows. It closes its hand, and the surface lies smooth. Here let the first scroll draw breath. The tale has begun in the oldest waters, and walked forward among charts and candles, among harbors that learned to count by absences. Ahead, the story will follow the great outward thrust, those long roads down the coasts of Africa, those audacious swings westward into blue emptiness and listen for the places where confidence faltered and names were surrendered to the deep. The ocean holds its court in all seasons. We, who only pass through, may sit and listen as the witnesses are called. islands that were and then were not, fleets that left and left no shadow, rivers that deliver to the sea with one hand in steel, with the other, if there is an answer, it will not be quick. But history, like the tide, is patient. It returns to the same stones with new water and wears them a little thinner. So shall we, returning to the old questions, by what agency, in what hour, under what sky, did the vanishing occur? Until even our persistence is a kind of prayer. The great voyages began as whispers in candlelit courts, Achaia, then unfurled as thunder upon the oceans. Princes and kings, thirsting for wealth and dominion, sent forth fleets clothed in bright banners, their prows carved with lions, angels, and saints. Yet for all their glory, these ships were no more protected than the fishing skiffs of humbler men. The sea, eternal in its mood, claimed both with impartial hand. Down the coast of Africa went the caravels of Portugal, their sails like wings, their compasses trembling with purpose. They sought spice, gold, and passage to the Indies. Many returned, their holds rich, their pilots honored. But there were others fewer spoken of, yet never forgotten, that vanished into the heavy swells. Families in Lisbon, waiting at windows overlooking the Tagus, counted the days, the weeks, until hope frayed. At last they turned their candles toward heaven, for the ocean had given no reply. Spanish fleets soon followed, proud galleons swollen with treasure from the New World. They were guarded with cannon, escorted by prayers, yet still they vanished. Some spoke of storms, but the seas offered no wreckage. Some accused pirates, but pirates left signs of plunder. These ships were taken whole, as though lifted bodily from the waters. The names of their captains were inked in royal ledgers, with the note non-read it did not return. Beyond that silence, the sailors who survived spoke in half-lights, in words chosen with care. They told of nights when the sky itself seemed wrong, when stars moved subtly from their appointed stations. They told of waters that turned the color of iron, of winds that blew without sound, of a great hush that fell upon the decks, so complete that even the creak of timbers ceased. And then, before dawn, other ships in convoy would find themselves alone, their companions erased as if by unseen hand. Phantom islands multiplied upon maps. Some appeared only once, recorded with solemnity by captains and sworn by witnesses, yet were never seen again. The Isle of Seven Cities, Antilia Hebrazel, San Baranda, names given to dreams, bait for the ambitious, ships sailed toward them, guided by faith and ink and compass. Sometimes they never returned. Mariners said the sea itself had sown false lands, mirages woven to lure and consume. And long after those names faded from maps, their legend lived on as graves without headstones. Asterisk the Baltic, too, told its tales. Merchant fleets, stout and well-armed, would leave Lubeck or Danzig with wool, timber, and amber. They passed through calm waters, watched by gulls, only to vanish between one headland and the next. Fishermen swore they heard bells tolling from beneath the waves, as if drowned cities below rang for the souls of the lost. Monks copied these accounts into ledgers, not as myth, but as testimony. The cargo lists were real, the grief of widows undeniable. In the Mediterranean, where Rome and Carthage once contended, the pattern persisted. Genoese fleet bound for Constantinople with cloth and coin disappeared utterly. A Venetian convoy, rich with glass and silk, was last seen leaving Crete, its sails shining in the dawn, and was never sighted again. Storms came and went, but no fragments were found, no mast upon the tide. Chroniclers, puzzled, wrote that such ships had been devoured by the sea as by a mouth. Legends clothed these vanishings in darker garments. Some said the waters opened as doors, swallowing ships into caverns beneath. Others swore of creatures vast and silent, whose passing could tilt a vessel until it sank without a struggle. Priests spoke of judgment. Sailors, more fearful, whispered of regions where the veil between worlds thinned, where a ship might stray from this earth into another. Whatever the cause, the fact was unchanging. Ships departed, and ships were not seen again. By the 16th century, when Magellan circled the globe and Drake plundered the seas, the chronicles of vanishing had grown as numerous as the tales of conquest. For every port gained, another was lost. For every land discovered, a fleet disappeared. The ocean, as if balancing the scales, allowed mankind its triumphs only by demanding its silences. And so the stories endured, carried in logbooks, etched in parish records, woven into songs sung in low taverns where sailors drank before voyages. The world changed. Kingdoms rose, empires shifted, maps grew crowded with names. Yet one truth held, from the age of oar to the age of sail, that the sea remembers what it takes, but never returns it whole. The treasure fleets of Spain were the grandest spectacles the ocean had yet seen. Laden with silver from Potosi, with gold torn from rivers, with emeralds plucked from mountain veins, they sailed in stately procession across the Atlantic. Each galleon was a floating fortress, bristling with cannon, guarded by prayer, and escorted by ships of war. To see them, depart Havana was to witness a pageant of empire, sunlight flashing on gilt and steel. Yet for all their might, for all their sanctity, not every fleet returned. There were convoys swallowed whole, their riches never reaching Seville's vaults. No survivor limped back with tale of storm or corsair. No driftwood washed ashore to tell of wreck. The sea had consumed them entire, as though wealth and men alike were mere morsels. The royal accountants grew pale. The priests declared judgment. The widows waited by doors that opened to no husband's step. And in taverns along the Andalusian coast, sailors muttered that the sea itself was jealous of Spain's glory. It had exacted tribute more precious than any coin, nor were the Portuguese spared. Their carracks, immense and laden with silks, pepper, and porcelain, sailed proudly from Goa and Cochin. Many reached Lisbon in triumph, their captains knighted, their cargoes paraded through the streets. Yet some carracks never returned, their names entered in royal archives beside a single word: lost. One such was the Flor du Mar, vast as a castle, swollen with the spoils of Malacca. She vanished into the Indian Ocean, her riches gone, her timbers unseen again. Some said she foundered in a storm, but if so, why did no relic drift ashore? The people whispered instead that the sea had hidden her in a vault beneath the waves, her treasure guarded by silence. The Dutch, too, who mastered the East Indies trade, felt the bite of absence. Their East Indiamen, stout and sure, were not proof against vanishing. Some set out from Batavia, bound for Amsterdam, and never reached the Cape. The routes were known, the weather recorded fair, yet no ship appeared. Charts were consulted, prayers offered, but the answer was only quiet horizon. Even the practical Dutch grew hushed, speaking of phantom shoals and waters that deceived the senses. Merchants who trusted no superstition at all still left offerings at chapels near the sea. Legends grew of fleets that wandered eternally, seen at times by lonely sailors who swore they glimpsed a procession of pale sails upon the horizon. These ghostly ships never answered hails, never altered course, and never closed the distance. They drifted against wind and current, their masts tattered yet upright. To some, they were warnings. To others, they were the souls of those who had vanished, condemned to sail between this world and the next, among the northern seas. Where fog curled low upon the water, tales multiplied of small fleets disappearing without trace. Fishermen left harbors in calm, their nets coiled neat, their decks well-ordered. Their boats returned days later, drifting together like a flock, sails slack, nets still unused, but no men. Vessels bore no mark of storm or violence. They were merely empty, as if the sea had chosen to erase only the human presence, leaving the wood and rope as taunt and reminder. In coastal villages, such events became woven into ritual. Chapels kept votive ships upon pegs, one always left, unclaimed for the vessel that would return without crew. When such derelicts indeed washed ashore, the people did not gasp in disbelief. They wept, but they had expected it. For they knew, as generations had taught them, that the sea takes what it desires. No vow, no chart, no empire can gainsay it. And so, through century upon century, the role of vanishing grew. The age of discovery filled maps with lands, but it filled the sea with silence. For every island gained, another convoy was lost. For every new shore, another name was added to the list of the missing. The ocean, eternal, demanded its balance. It opened pathways but exacted tolls, tolls not measured in coin, but in absence. Thus the chronicles of disappearance wove themselves into the very fabric of history. They are not footnotes. They are the dark ink between the lines, the pauses. In the song, the gaps in the tapestry, the sea's memory is long, but it is not generous. It keeps what it takes. And men, left with only silence, turned absence into legend, legend into warning, and warning into prayer. From the moment man first drew maps, there were places marked not by certainty, but by dread. These were the waters whispered of in taverns, marked by faint ink upon charts, and spoken of only in hushed voices when the wind rose. The oceans of the world were vast, but within them lay certain corridors where ships faltered, where compasses spun, and where silence reigned more heavily than elsewhere. To these regions clung the word cursed. Foremost among them, though named only in later centuries, is that stretch of ocean bounded by strange geometry, later called the Bermuda Triangle. Yet long before it bore that name, sailors of Spain and Portugal had felt its breath. They told of skies that blackened without cloud, of waters that grew slick as oil, and of horizons that bent themselves into unnatural shapes. Columbus himself recorded lights flickering upon the edge of the sea, moving with no cause, and of compasses that pointed not true north, but wandered like restless minds. His courage pressed him onward, yet many who followed him were not seen again. The triangle, nameless then, was already shaping its reputation in the hearts of sailors. But it was not alone. In the cold north, the Segelhorst carried its own tale of disappearance. A fleet of merchants left its river mouth, laden with grain, timber, and coin. Their departure was noted in tidy script, their sails watched by townsfolk from the shore. Yet no arrival was ever recorded. Days lengthened into weeks, and still the river mouth gave back no answer. No storm had been seen, no raiders prowled, no wreckage floated downstream. It was as if the river itself had swallowed the ships whole, handing them to the sea as tribute. The chronicles remember only silence, and the name Segelhorst has never been freed of that shadow. Nor were these two regions solitary in their strangeness. In the North Atlantic, sailors told of waters where the swell grew hollow, where sound carried strangely, and where birds fled as if frightened. In the Indian Ocean, pilots spoke of currents that tangled themselves into knots, dragging even strong ships into circles that led nowhere. And in the Pacific, vast and inscrutable, whole fleets were said to vanish between one island and the next, leaving only empty horizons. Legends gathered around such places like mist. Sailors swore of whirlpools vast as cities, opening without warning to drag ships beneath. Others told of false horizons, where sky and water twisted together until direction itself dissolved. Some whispered of lights beneath the waves, moving in ordered ranks, as though an unseen army marched upon the ocean floor. Priests named these signs as demons. Sailors muttered of older powers, nameless and cold. From the Baltic to the Azores, from Segelhorst to the coasts of Africa. The theme was constant. Waters that betrayed, paths that ended not in landfall but in void. And though kings sent admirals, though merchants paid pilots, though priests blessed fleets, none could undo the silence once it had fallen. For silence was the sea's own weapon, older than storm or tide. It was said among sailors that the ocean keeps a toll. Each year, it grants passage to many, but it demands a price in return. The storms are part of that price, the reefs another. Yet the greatest toll is the vanishing. The ships that leave no splinter, the men who leave no bone. These are the coin with which mankind pays for daring to cross the waters. So the chronicles of disappearance were bound to place. The warm Atlantic, where the lights danced. The frozen Baltic, where boats returned without men. The rivers of the north that fed the sea with silence. They became the geography of fear, drawn not on parchment but in memory, taught not by schoolmasters but by widows. and though the names of empires changed, the places remained, fixed in the ocean's secret map. Sailors who braved these waters returned with eyes shadowed by memory, and their words spoken over mugs of ale or in the stillness of monastery cloisters added threads to the great tapestry of vanishing. They told of seas that grew unnaturally, calm where no wave dared to rise and the air pressed heavy upon the lungs. They told of mists that moved with will, curling around the hull and swallowing sound, so that even the cry of a gull was muffled as though smothered in cloth. Men swore that in such fogs time itself stretched thin, watches grew meaningless, and the ship wandered not across distance, but in circles upon itself. When the mist lifted, often the vessel was alone, her companions erased. The chronicles of Segelhorst spoke in colder tones. The Weser River was a familiar friend to those who lived upon its banks. Its moods, its currents, its floods, all were known. Yet when that fleet of merchants vanished, the people felt betrayed, for the river had always been a passage, not a grave. No broken mast floated homeward, no crate or cask was returned to shore. In the ledger of the monastery, a scribe wrote, "With hand unsteady, they were seen, they were counted, they were gone." He added no cause, for none could be found. In the centuries since, villagers along that river have repeated the tale, and each repetition adds another weight to the silence. That follows it, the Bermuda waters carried their own omens. A pilot wrote of a sea that glowed faintly green at night, as though lit from beneath, yet when soundings were taken, no bottom answered. Others spoke of compasses that twisted, pointing not north, but towards some invisible center in the sea. Whole fleets reported fair skies only to vanish in calm weather. Priests who blessed the departing ships could not explain why no prayer sufficed. The Atlantic there seemed to hold its breath as though watching, waiting for a moment to close its hand. Nor were these vanishings bound to one corner of the world. In the Mediterranean, there were gulfs whispered of where ships could be seen sailing upon the surface yet were never reached. In the northern seas, men feared the silent shoals where boats returned with sails full, but decks empty. In the Indian Ocean, traders told of islands glimpsed on the horizon that melted into air, luring ships into nothingness. Each culture clothed these events in its own language, curses, spirits, gods, but the shape of the absence was always the same, and always legends followed. Some said the sea opened doors, gateways to hidden caverns beneath, where ships were drawn into halls of silence. Others swore of vast beings, unseen but felt, that passed beneath the hull, so large that their presence itself unmoored the soul. Sailors spoke of hearing voices in the night, whispers carried on the wind, urging them to follow. Those who obeyed never returned. Those who resisted found themselves haunted forever by the memory of that call. But the most persistent legend was simpler still, that the sea demanded its tithe. Each year, as fleets multiplied, as empires grew bold, the ocean claimed its share. Some were lost by storm, others by war, but some were taken by silence alone. And it was said that these silent losses were the most binding, for they reminded mankind that the sea was not merely water, but a will. Thus did the cursed waters gain their names, not from kings or scholars, but from the mouths of those who had felt their pull. The Bermuda, the Segelhorst, the White Road, the Phantom Isles, each became more than a place. They became warnings. To cross them was to gamble not only with storm and hunger, but with absence itself. And so the chronicles of the vanishings grew, woven into the lore of sailors, written in the annals of monasteries, whispered in the prayers of widows. The ocean had spoken, not in words, but in silence. And men who feared silence more than storm listened with dread. With each generation, the dread grew heavier. Sailors who had never set foot beyond their native harbors still spoke of those cursed waters, as though the tales themselves had drifted. Ashore like wreckage, a boy who mended nets in a northern village could tell the story of Segelhorst as clearly as if he had sailed it himself. A girl in Lisbon, watching the tall masts depart, whispered of the green sea that swallows without. Storm. Fear had become inheritance, passed down like an heirloom more enduring than coin. And yet men still sailed. Gold called them, spice beckoned them, kings commanded them. They went forth knowing that some roads upon the ocean had no return. For absence does not deter ambition, it only cloaks it in shadow. The Bermuda waters gathered more witnesses. Convoys that departed Cadiz in gleaming order sometimes reached Havana shrunken, with one or two ships missing, their captains grim-faced, refusing to speak of what they had seen. Others arrived in tatters, reporting that, in the midst of fair weather, a companion vessel had simply drifted from sight. "We looked astern," wrote one scribe, "and where her masts should have been, there was only the empty line of horizon." Weeks later, the families of that vessel's men lit candles, but no bodies, no planks, no sails were ever found. Segelhorst, though less traveled, bore its legends stubbornly. Centuries after the first fleet was lost, merchants still crossed themselves when the Weser ran high. Pilots refused to speak of certain stretches in the river, claiming they could hear a faint tolling beneath the waves, as if drowned bells rang. From the depths, scholars dismissed it as fancy, yet the villagers knew better. For the river, like the sea it joined, had its own memory and its own silence. Other seas offered their riddles. The Baltic whispered of fishermen who rode into the white road had never returned, though their nets were later found drifting in perfect order. The Indian Ocean told of Portuguese carracks sighted off Madagascar that were never seen again, though their holds had been heavy with treasure. In the Pacific, native songs remembered canoes that chased false islands shimmering in the heat, never to return to shore. Each ocean had its own Segelhorst, its own Bermuda, its own place where the fabric of certainty grew thin. Men sought explanations, for the mind cannot bear absence without reason. They spoke of whirlpools vast as cities hidden beneath calm waves. They spoke of gases rising from the deep, suffocating crews before they could cry for help. They spoke of magnetic stones buried in the earth's belly, tugging compasses astray. Learned men wrote their theories in careful ink, but the sailors shook their heads. The theories explained the sea, but they did not explain the silence, for silence was the true enemy. Storms howled, waves struck, winds tore, yet these were honest foes, leaving wreckage, cries, and graves. But silence left nothing, not even a shadow. A ship seen at dawn might be gone by dusk, her place upon the water smoothed over as though she had never been. That was the sea's deepest power, not destruction, but erasure. And so the cursed waters became not merely places upon a map, but thresholds of fear. The Bermuda, the Segelhorst, the White Road. The Phantom Isles, they were not just coordinates, but warnings woven into the fabric of seafaring life. To cross them was to test the sea's patience. To survive them was to return with eyes shadowed, carrying a tale half-whispered, half-feared. The chronicles preserve these tales not as curiosities, but as wounds in history. For each vanished ship bore not only men, but hopes, ambitions, prayers. When they vanished, so too did the futures. They might have built, and that more than the loss of wood and sail was what the sea devoured, the unwritten chapters of human life. Thus did the oceans acquire their darker geographies, places, as fixed in memory as any cape or strait, though no compass could mark them. The Bermuda waters, where lights glimmered without cause and fleets dissolved as if into dream, a Weser. At Segelhorst, whose quiet surface hid a ledger of absence, no merchant would speak of aloud. The Baltic's white road, where fishermen vanished, leaving only nets adrift. The Indian Ocean, with its phantom islands that lured proud carracks to silence. The Pacific, broad and inscrutable, where canoes and caravels alike pursued horizons that melted into air. These were not simply waters. They were thresholds.
Ow.
To cross them was to wager one's name against eternity. Some ships passed safely through, their captains scoffing at superstition, their crews singing bold songs. Yet others, no less skillful, no less faithful, stepped into those same corridors and did not return, The difference was not seamanship, nor prayer, nor courage. It was the ocean's will alone, unreadable and unmoved. The chronicles grew heavy with such tales. Scribes wrote of ships that left no wreck. Priests recorded names for masses that never ended. Widows lit candles that burned low without answer. Merchants calculated losses in coin. Sailors counted them in silence, though nations rose upon. The wealth of their fleets, each knew in its secret heart that the sea could, at any hour, demand tribute in the form of disappearance, theologians argued. Some said these vanishings were punishment, others declared them tests of faith. Mariners, less concerned with doctrine, spoke instead of balance. The sea is a market, they said, and it trades in lives. We buy passage with our courage, and sometimes the sea refuses to sell. Legends hardened into ritual. In certain harbors, captains poured wine into the tide before departure, a libation for the waters. In others, women wove charms of rope and shell to hang upon the mast. None of these stopped the vanishings, but they gave sailors a language with which to face them. For silence, too, must be answered, if only with prayer or story, and so the cursed waters endured, not erased by chart or empire. The more ships sailed, the more names were added to the roll of the missing. Though storms and pirates and reefs took their share, it was the vanishings without cause that carved themselves deepest into memory. For nothing is feared so greatly as that which leaves no trace. Thus Part 2 closes. Scroll of dread waters and haunted names, where absence itself became geography. Ahead lies the next great chapter, the tales of the vast treasure fleets and the proud ships of the age of discovery, vessels of empire, swollen with wealth and faith, that sailed into the blue and never returned. There the ocean claimed not only men, but empire's dreams. The age of discovery had unrolled like a vast tapestry, embroidered with gold and blood. Across its fabric, kings and queens set their designs. Colonies carved upon strange shores. Wealth ferried home in convoys. The sea made into a highway for ambition. Yet though the ships were greater and the sails mightier, the sea did not change. It remained an ancient mouth, patient and unsated, swallowing fleets as easily as it had. Swallowed fishing boats and river cogs in centuries past. The Spanish treasure fleets were the pride of Europe. From the ports of the New World they sailed, bellies swollen with silver from Potosi, with gold from the rivers of Peru, with emeralds and pearls that glittered like fragments of the sun, escorted by men of war, blessed by priests and guarded by the fearsome reputation of empire. They seemed untouchable. Yet they, too, were subject to the ledger of absence. There are entries in the Casa de Contratation, Seville's solemn archive of commerce, where a fleet is marked as having departed Havana in full order and is thereafter struck from the record, replaced by a line of ink. None read it, it did not return. No wreckage, no survivor, no plundered cargo. An entire procession of ships gone, as though the Atlantic had simply closed its jaws. The priests prayed, the widows wept, and the merchants whispered of curses. The Flor do Mar, pride of Portugal, met a fate no less cruel. Vast as a fortress, she bore the spoils of Malacca, treasure enough to dazzle a kingdom, as she sailed into the Indian Ocean and never sailed out again. Some claimed storm, others mutiny, but no proof was ever given. The sea had taken her entire treasure and all, and gave no token in return. For centuries men dreamed of finding her on the ocean floor, but the silence of the waters endured. Nor did the Dutch, masters of trade and chart, escape the ocean's hunger. Their East Indiamen were stout and sure, designed for the endless road between Batavia and Amsterdam. Yet whole ships vanished between sight of Madagascar and the Cape, waters well known, their routes carefully plotted. Other convoys returned, missing one or two companions, lost without storm or struggle. In Amsterdam's counting houses, clerks noted the deficit in cargo. But in the taverns, sailors spoke of false stars and horizons that folded in upon themselves. Even the English, later masters of sea power, felt the chill. Their ships sailed for Virginia, for the Indies, for Africa. Some returned with holds full, of sugar and tobacco, but others did not return at all. Colonies waited for provisions that never arrived. Their names whispered in fear is another example of the ocean's tax, and as empires multiplied their fleets, the ocean multiplied its vanishings. For every triumph of empire, there was a silence. For every chest of treasure landed at port, there was another sealed beneath the sea. Legends deepened. Some said that the ocean kept vaults beneath its surface, chambers where lost ships lay in. Endless rows, their sails still furled, their treasures still gleaming in the dark. Others swore that the missing fleets were not destroyed, but transported, carried into another world, another ocean, where they sailed still beneath unfamiliar stars. Mariners told of dreams in which they saw such ships passing silently across a midnight sea, their crews pale and wordless, their eyes fixed upon horizons no living man could name. What troubled men most was not the storms, nor even the pirates, for these foes could be fought. What troubled them was the silence. A fleet might leave a port with drums and banners, with prayers and shouts of joy, and then dissolve into the void. Families waited, merchants waited, kings waited, the days became weeks, the weeks months, until silence itself became the answer. Thus, the age of discovery, with all its grandeur, bore the same wound as the ages before. Its maps grew crowded with names of lands, yet its seas grew crowded with absences. For every empire built, the sea claimed its tribute in ships, in men, in entire fleets that left no shadow, and in every harbor, in every chapel, in every tavern where sailors gathered, the same truth was spoken. The sea remembers. It remembers in silence, and it keeps what it takes. The chronicles of empire swelled with the names of ships that were spoken once, and then erased. Sailors remembered. Them widows prayed for them, but the sea alone kept their company. Asterisk among the most mourned were the treasure fleets of Spain. Each year they crossed the Atlantic in stately procession, sails proud as banners, holds heavy with silver bars, with golden chalices, with jewels bright enough to blind. To watch them depart Havana was to see an empire afloat. And yet more than once, whole convoys never arrived. They were not defeated by cannon, for no wreckage of war was found. They were not undone by storm, for no splinter or survivor washed ashore. They simply failed to exist beyond a certain horizon. In Seville's counting house, clerks wrote their tallies of expected coin, and when the fleets did not come, they wrote the words lost to sea. But behind those words lay the silence of hundreds of men, hundreds of futures, all swallowed by the unseen. Portugal, too, lamented her share. Her carracks were cathedrals of oak, towering upon the swells, carrying pepper, cinnamon, and porcelain across half the world. Yet some did not endure the voyage. The snow, Joao, homeward bound from India, vanished in storm without survivor or trace. The Flor du Mar, laden with the riches of Malacca, was whispered to have sunk beneath waves too deep for any diver to reclaim. Mariners said she was not destroyed but hidden, locked in the sea's own vault, her treasure gleaming in darkness. To this day, no rumor of her rediscovery has ever broken the silence, and so she remains a ghost of history, a name weighted with loss. The Dutch, ever pragmatic, filled their ledgers with profit and with sorrow alike. Their East Indiamen set forth in fleets, but some ships in those fleets vanished between one headland and the next. A captain might swear he had seen his companion, vessel at dawn, only for it to be gone by dusk, with fair weather in between. The Dutch did not speak of curses, but even their merchants whispered uneasily of phantom islands, mirages that drew ships into nothingness. More than one navigator confessed, before his death, that the stars themselves sometimes betrayed him, shifting subtly in the sky, leading him to chart courses that ended only in silence. The English, bold in their ambition, planted colonies and set sail with provisions, yet their own ships too vanished into the depths. Some were bound for Virginia, others for the Indies, others for distant coasts of Africa. Their cargoes were noted, their departures celebrated, their sails last glimpsed, from the cliffs of Cornwall or the quays of Plymouth, but they never made their landfall. Colonies waited for supplies that never came. Back in England, families waited for letters that never arrived. The names of these ships were added to the roll of the missing, where absence itself became there. Epitaph legends flowered to fill the void. Some sailors told of seas that opened like doors, swallowing fleets whole into caverns beneath the waves. Others spoke of stars that shifted like tricksters, drawing navigators into paths that led nowhere. There were tales of ghostly fleets seen drifting against wind and current, pale sails glowing faintly in the moonlight. Those who saw them swore they were the souls of lost convoys, condemned to sail forever upon seas that belonged to no world. It was said in taverns that the ocean had its price, its yearly tithe. For every treasure-laden galleon that reached port, another would be claimed. For every triumph of empire, another silence would fall. Kings might rule men, merchants might count coin, but the sea remained sovereign, and its laws were older than parchment or crown, and still men sailed. For gold outweighed fear, and ambition outlasted dread. But the memory of the vanished never departed. It lingered in candlelit chapels and logbooks marked with sudden blanks, in the eyes of widows watching the horizon. The sea was not only a highway of empire. It was also a crypt without stones, and its silence echoed louder than the crash of any storm. The empire's fleets became the very arteries of the world, pulsing with spice, silver, and silk. Yet for every artery there was a clot, a silence, where the lifeblood of empire simply ceased to flow. In Lisbon, the wives of sailors learned to read the river Tagus, not only for arrivals, but for the absences it announced. When a fleet was late, the water itself seemed to stand heavier, as though it carried a burden of secrets. Rumors reached the shore in fragments. A ship sighted days out from the Azores that never made the final landfall. A convoy glimpsed in full order, only to dwindle by one vessel when next observed. Men swore they had seen lanterns in the night. A companion's light dancing faithfully across the waves, until suddenly it vanished and the sea lay empty. Such vanishings left no narrative, only a blank that grew darker the more it was stared at. The Spanish knew this darkness well. Their treasure fleets, though blessed by priests and guarded by men of war, still succumbed. Whole convoys that should have burst into Seville with banners and trumpets instead dissolved into rumor. The king's treasuries thinned, creditors muttered, yet the greater toll was borne by the women who kept lamps in their windows long after hope had fled. In some parishes, the bells tolled not in measured peals, but in a single, long note, the sound reserved for those whose deaths could not be named. The Portuguese carracks, for all their grandeur, proved equally mortal. Mariners told of vessels that seemed to sink not by storm, but by vanishing from sight. A ship hailed in the morning mist would be gone by noon, leaving only the echo of its bell across the swells. The bomb Jesus, a vessel bound from Lisbon to India, disappeared so completely that it became a proverb among sailors. She was swallowed like the bomb Jesus. Generations later, men still muttered the phrase when a vessel failed to appear. The Dutch merchants, practical in their speech, kept their grief in ledgers. Beside the list of expected spices, cloth, and porcelain, a clerk might write in a tight hand, "Vessel unaccounted." Behind those words lay hundreds of lives, yet the account book moved on. But sailors who trusted ledgers less carried other words. They spoke of the shifting road, a stretch of water near the Cape, where ships turned inward upon themselves. Compasses faltered, stars deceived, and vessels slipped away, unseen even by their fellows. To the clerks, these were numbers missing from the page. To the sailors, they were presences missing from the world. England, too, came to know the sting of silence. Colonies starved for supplies when the ships carrying their lifeblood vanished at sea. A vessel might be last seen from Plymouth, its sails bright against the horizon, and then never again. Colonists watched the horizon in hunger. Families at home watched in grief. The ocean had claimed not only ships, but the fragile bridge between two worlds. Legends of the vanished fleets grew thick upon every shore. Some told of the vault of the sea, a cavern beneath the waves where lost ships lay in endless procession. their treasure still gleaming in silence, guarded by the deep. Others swore of another world, a mirror ocean, where vanished fleets sailed still beneath alien constellations. Sailors claimed they had glimpsed such ships gliding across a midnight sea, their crews pale and wordless, eyes fixed upon horizons no living man could name. To the empires, the vanishings were a wound upon ambition. For every triumph brought home in gold, another was stolen in silence. For every new map drawn, another fleet disappeared into blankness. The sea permitted expansion, but only by exacting its tithe. It was not merely water, but law, and its law was absence. And so, as the 17th century waned, the chronicles of disappearance weighed heavy upon Europe's heart. The world was richer than ever before, yet it was also haunted. For every port swollen with treasure, another rang with mourning. The sea had made itself eternal partner to empire, generous in gifts, merciless in demands. The roll of vanished fleets grew so long that it began to seem a second history, a shadowed ledger running beside the triumphs of empire. In bright letters the courts recorded victories, discoveries, riches brought home. But in darker ink, hidden in ledgers and in the laments of widows, lay the other record, the names of fleets that went out but did not return. At Havana, the great mustering ground of Spain's treasure fleets, sailors drank deeply before departure, not only in joy, but in fear. For every man who loaded silver onto the galleons knew of others who had done the same and been erased. Some convoys vanished entire, their fate unlearned. Others returned missing a single ship, the gap in the line as eloquent as a cry. Captains swore they had seen their companions mere hours before, sails full and steady, only for the sea to smooth itself and leave emptiness behind, at Lisbon. Merchants prayed over the carracks before they set out across the Indian Ocean. The ships towered upon the tide, proud and solemn, yet even their grandeur could not shield them. A carrack might vanish between one port and the next without any sign of wreck. Families waited upon the quay, peering out at the river, until the truth could no longer be denied. Chroniclers recorded such absences as overcome by tempest, but the silence of the survivors belied the explanation. For no wreckage, no flotsam, no relic returned in Amsterdam. The loss of East Indiamen was counted in cloves, nutmeg, and pepper. The ledgers showed deficits. The merchants grumbled. But among the sailors, the talk was different. They whispered of false stars above the cape, constellations that looked true but drew ships astray. They told of seas that stilled themselves, until even the wind seemed dead, a silence that drove men to despair. Some ships emerged again from such stillness, but others were never seen. Asterisk in England. The silence carried across oceans to the starving colonies. Provisions that should have arrived in spring did not. Men dug shallow graves and wondered at the fate of their supply ships. In Plymouth and London, families lit candles for fathers, sons, and brothers whose names were now written not in parish books, but in absence itself. The silence of the ocean stretched across the empire, binding shore to shore in grief. Legends answered where history failed. Sailors swore that beneath the waves lay a hidden realm, the vault of the sea, where lost fleets were gathered in eternal procession. There the Flor du Mar gleamed still with Malacca's treasure. There the galleons of Spain rested with their silver. There the Dutch East Indiamen kept their cargoes intact, waiting in the dark. Others whispered of a mirror world, an ocean beyond. The ocean, where vanished ships sailed still beneath alien constellations, never reaching shore, never finding peace. The chronicles of disappearance became hymns of absence, sung not by minstrels but by memory itself. They taught that no empire, no matter how mighty, could command the sea. The ocean gave riches and roots, but it also demanded tribute in silence. Its toll was not measured in gold, but in the futures of men. And so, as the 17th century closed and the 18th dawned, the sea held its ledger open still. The treasure fleets, the proud carracks, the East Indiamen, the colonial vessels, all were subject to its law. Ships might leave with fanfare and faith, but the sea, eternal and indifferent, could erase them in a breath. Thus ends this scroll of vanished fleets, a hymn to the silence that walked beside empire. Ahead, the tale will turn to other seas and other legends, the haunted waters of the north, the phantom islands of the Atlantic, the forgotten gulfs where fishermen vanished as surely as galleons. For the sea's appetite was never sated, and its story was far from done. The northern waters bore a character colder, harsher, yet no less haunted than the great oceans of empire. Here the winds keened like mourners, the fog lay thick as wool, and the sun, when it showed itself, was pale as a dying lamp. Among such seas, vanishings were whispered of not as rare calamities, but as the rhythm of life itself. For to dwell beside the Baltic, the North Sea, or the frozen fjords was to live under the shadow of absence. The Baltic League of Merchants, proud in their discipline, knew the weight of loss. Their cogs and hulks carried timber, wool, amber, and grain across narrow straits. They were not great fleets of treasure, but they were the lifeblood of towns and guilds. Yet chronicles of Lubeck, Danzig, and Riga repeat the same refrain: convoys leaving with fair wind and full cargo, never seen again. No raiders were sighted, no storms recorded, no survivors found. Their absence was noted in ledgers as coolly as coin miscounted. But among the sailors, the tales grew darker. There was the White Road, a strip of sea where mist always gathered, whether in summer or frost. Boats that strayed into it often failed to return. On rare occasions, their hulls drifted back. Days later, sails slack, nets folded neat, but decks empty of men. A fisherman swore the sea had claimed their souls alone, leaving only the wood to mock the living. Monks in Baltic cloisters wrote prayers for these lost souls, but even their stern Latin admits unease. Mar tacitum, the silent sea, they called it, for its stillness was more feared than any storm in the fjords of Norway. The sea was said to sing. At dusk, when the tide turned, fishermen heard low murmurs rising from beneath the water. Some said it was the voices of drowned men calling their kin. Others swore it was the breath of great beasts that moved unseen. Whatever the cause, those who lingered too long were seldom seen again. Villages told of whole crews vanishing between one tide and the next. Their boats later found tied neatly, as though waiting for men who would never return. Further west, along the storm-racked coasts of Scotland and Ireland, legends grew of phantom isles. Maps of the 13th and 14th centuries marked them with solemn ink. Hebraziel, Antilia, the Isle of Seven Cities. Sailors swore they had seen their shores glimmering upon the horizon, green and fertile, crowned with towers. Bold captains turned their prows toward them, chasing the promise of landfall. Yet when they arrived, there was nothing but water. Some never returned at all. It was said the sea itself wove such mirages, bait for the greedy and the bold. Islands vanished from maps in later centuries, but their memory lingered, spoken of with dread in the lamplight of coastal taverns. The Mediterranean, though smaller and tamer by measure, held its own phantoms. Genoese charts spoke of an isle west of Sardinia, where a fleet once landed, never to be seen again. Thereafter, the isle itself was never found. Venetian pilots, cautious men, marked such places with symbols of skulls or crosses, warnings that no treasure was worth the risk. Yet still, from time to time, ships were lured to horizons that melted into air. Thus the northern seas and phantom isles carried their share of vanishings, no less solemn than the treasure fleets of Spain or Portugal. They reminded mankind that loss was not confined to empires, but belonged also to humble fishermen, to merchants, to all who dared the horizon. The ocean did not discriminate. It claimed king's galleon and peasant's boat alike, and through these tales, one truth rang clear. The sea could invent its own geography. Islands that appeared and disappeared, roads of mist that erased men, fjords that sang with voices of the dead, all these were places as real in the minds of sailors as any cape or bay. They were not drawn upon parchment in later years, but they lived in memory, in song, and in silence. If the sea's greatest terror was disappearance without trace, its cruelest jest was the ship returned intact yet empty, a husk without its heart. To find wreckage was grief, for wreckage told of storm, of struggle, of last cries carried by the wind. But to find a vessel whole, her timbers unbroken, her cargo untouched, her decks in order and no souls aboard, that was a silence deeper. Still, for such ships were not wrecks, but ghosts. Tales of ghost ships drift through the centuries like sea mist. They were spoken of in taverns, copied by cautious scribes, and sworn upon by mariners who had seen their pale outlines against the moon. Some were derelicts found drifting, others were visions that vanished at approach. But all bore the same mark, the absence of the living, in the cold northern seas. Fishermen told of a fleet of small boats found drifting together as though tethered by invisible cord. Their nets were coiled, their oars stowed, their lanterns trimmed. But no men. The boats were brought ashore, studied, prayed over, but no cause was ever known. The villagers concluded only what their grandfathers had said before, that the sea had taken the men and left the wood as mockery further south. In the warm waters of the Mediterranean, a Genoese vessel was found adrift, her sails ragged, but her hull firm. On board were provisions, tools, and charts all in their place. But her crew had gone as though they had stepped from the deck into air. No sign of struggle, no trace of storm, no hint of plague, only silence. She was towed back to port, examined by priests and merchants alike, and at last abandoned, for none dared sail her again. They said she carried not cargo but curse. The Atlantic, vaster and older in mood, produced its own apparitions. Sailors swore of seeing tall ships, with sails glowing faintly, gliding against the wind. Their decks were empty, their rigging unmanned, yet they moved with strange purpose. To hail them was to invite madness, for they never answered. Some swore that approaching such a vessel meant being drawn into its silence, condemned to join its crew of none. These stories were told with dread, yet always with conviction, as though the teller had glimpsed such a sight himself. Even in harbors, ghostly returns were known. A merchant ship once sailed from Bristol, bound for Bordeaux. Weeks later, she was found drifting into the same harbor she had left, her sails loose, her anchor dragging. Townsfolk rushed to greet her, but on board was only emptiness. Cargo intact, table set, a lamp still burning, but no men. She was moored, investigated, prayed over, and at last dismantled. For none wished to keep a ship that had crossed into silence. Legends clothed such tales in darker garments. Some said the sea was jealous, that it envied the fellowship of men, and so stripped them away, leaving only wood and sail behind. Others swore of voices calling in the night, luring crews into the waves with promises of land or loved ones long dead. A few whispered of storms unseen, storms not of wind and rain, but of spirit, sweeping across decks and carrying men into other realms. Whatever the cause, the fact was unchanging. The ship returned, the crew did not. And so ghost ships became symbols as potent as any cathedral bell. They were not merely vessels. They were sermons in timber. They warned that even survival of the hull was no safeguard, that the sea could give back a ship whole, yet take from it the essence of life. And those who found such ships were never comforted, for they knew that absence was a more terrible fate than wreckage. If the open sea was the wide theater of vanishing, then the coasts were the galleries where mankind listened for echoes of what had been taken. For centuries, sailors, widows, fishers' children, and monks in cliff-bound cloisters told of sounds carried on the wind, faint tollings of bells beneath the surf, voices that rose from the deep, warnings sung in tones too solemn for mortal throats. These were not tales of ships sighted and lost, but of the sea itself remembering in strange lamentia along the Baltic shores, where winter locked the harbors in glass. There spread the legend of the sunken cities. It was said that towns once stood proud upon those coasts, but were swallowed whole by the waters for their pride. On storm nights, when the ice broke and the wind keened, fishermen swore they could hear bells tolling beneath the waves, as though the drowned churches still kept their vigil. Those who lingered too long upon the water listening often did not return. The villagers said they had been called home by the bells, in Brittany, peasants told of ease, the city of sin drowned beneath the sea for its wickedness. On quiet evenings, sailors claimed to hear the faint ringing of its cathedral bells rising through the tide. Some swore they saw lights dancing far out upon the waves, as though the streets of ease still glimmered in ghostly procession. More than one ship that steered toward such lights never came back, their names added to the ledger of silence. Along the German coast, near the Weser where Segelhorst kept its darker memory, monks recorded tales of chants echoing from the river. At night, as if a procession passed unseen, one wrote, though the cloister lay still, the chants came most often after a fleet was lost. Pilgrims said it was the souls of the drowned, keeping their own mass in the halls of the deep. And some who followed the sound upon the water were never seen again. In Ireland, the phantom isle of Hybrazil was not only seen, but heard. Fishermen claimed that as they neared its mirage shores, they heard the tolling of bells and the murmur of voices chanting in strange tongue. Those who pursued the sound vanished with their boats. Only the echo lingered. Maps bore the isle's name for centuries, though no man set foot upon it and returned. Nor were such legends confined to Europe. In the Indian Ocean, traders whispered of the city of Zerzura, drowned beneath the waves, whose bells rang when storms rose. Off the African coast, it was said that the great bells of Meru, carried away in conquest, had been swallowed by the tide and that they tolled whenever ships were about to vanish. And in the vast Pacific, islanders told of ancestral villages lost to the sea, whose drums could still be heard on moonlit nights, summoning the living to join the dead. These coastal legends carried one truth in common. The sea does not forget. It remembers in sound, in tollings and whispers, in ghostly echoes that call men from shore. To hear such voices was omen. To follow them was death. Yet, even in dread, the people listened, for grief seeks communion, and the bells seemed to offer it. Better to believe the lost were singing beneath the waves than to accept only silence. Among the many faces of the sea, few inspired as much terror as the whirlpool. Storms could be outrun, reefs could be charted, pirates could be fought. The whirlpool was a mouth that opened without warning, a circle of water that spun with ceaseless hunger, dragging all into its throat. Tales of such maelstroms filled the chronicles of sailors from every shore, and many a disappearance was laid at their feet in the northern seas. Where cliffs rose stark against iron-colored waves, the Norsemen spoke of the great maelstrom of Lofoten. It was no myth, for the waters truly surged and circled with fury where tides met narrow straits. Fishermen feared it as one fears a beast that stirs in its lair. 4 boats that strayed too close were drawn into its spiral, broken and never seen again. Yet beyond the true whirlpool lay the greater legend, that some maelstroms did not kill outright, but swallowed vessels whole, dragging them into caverns beneath the sea. There, said the sagas, the ships remained intact, their crews alive but trapped in endless night. The Greeks too had their stories. Homer sang of Charybdis, the monstrous whirlpool that drank the sea and vomited it again, threatening even Odysseus. With its rage, to the ancients, it was not mere current, but a divine mouth, a punishment placed upon the waters by gods. And though centuries passed, the belief endured that certain straits, narrow and treacherous, were haunted by living hunger. The Strait of Messina, the Bosporus, the Dardanelles, all bore rumors of whirlpools that opened at sudden hours, dragging ships beneath without trace. In the Atlantic, sailors swore of waters that turned upon themselves with no warning. Sea began to circle, wrote one chronicler, though no wind blew and no tide was due. The ship turned with it, and the men cried out. But in the space of an hour the vessel was gone, and only foam marked the place. Such entries appear in scattered records, always brief, for the survivors were few. But the legend of the seam mouths grew places where the ocean itself swallowed without storm. The Indian Ocean held its own terrors. Near Madagascar and the Comoros, mariners spoke of whirlpools vast enough to drag even the mighty carracks beneath. Traders whispered of the BIA. Dos Mortos, the Bay of the Dead, where currents twisted into spirals without end. Some believed that beneath those waters lay a sunken city, its hunger forever pulling down new victims to keep it company. Even the Pacific, boundless and inscrutable, was not free of such lore. Island navigators told of places where the sea turned in upon itself, devouring canoes and leaving only silence. They warned their sons never to cross those waters when certain stars aligned, for then the whirlpools awoke. Those who did not heed were said to vanish not into the depths, but into other realms. Carried beyond the horizon of the living, the whirlpools and straits of doom thus became not only hazards, but symbols. They were the mouths of the sea, reminders that the ocean was not flat, but alive, with a will that could open and close at will. Mariners drew them on charts with dark ink, often accompanied by grim symbols. They were marked not merely as dangers, but as places where the sea's hunger was most visible, and so the chronicles of vanishing bore their names alongside the treasure fleets and phantom isles. For though storms and silence were feared, the whirlpool was dread embodied, the sea revealing its appetite in plain sight. To be lost to a maelstrom was to be devoured, body and ship together, in one merciless act. Beyond whirlpools and storms, the ocean bore subtler snares, illusions wrought in air and water, omens written in light and shadow. Sailors feared these, as much as any visible peril, for they did not strike with violence, but with deception. To follow a false star was to wander into emptiness. To chase a phantom light was to sail into silence. The earliest chronicles speak of wandering stars. Phoenician pilots who trusted their lives to the night sky told of constellations that seemed to shift their places, betraying even the seasoned navigator. A star once fixed above the mast would drift like a will-o'-the-wisp, luring the vessel from its true course. When dawn came, the fleet might find itself scattered, its companions gone, its position unmarked. Some never reassembled. The sea gave no answer, and so the vanished were written down as astray. Greek mariners, keen-eyed readers of heaven, told of horizons that bent. On calm nights, when the sea lay smooth as glass, the line between water and sky seemed to waver, curving subtly until ships sailed toward what they believed was land, only to discover nothing beneath their bows. Some turned back in time, others did not. To vanish upon a false horizon was no less final than to sink in storm. Later sailors voyaging further into the Atlantic met stranger omens still. They saw lights dancing above the waves, flickering blue and green as though stars had fallen upon the sea. Some called them corpos santos, spirits of drowned men. Others said they were the hands of angels, warning of storms. Yet not all believed them warnings. Many thought them beckonings, and ships that followed such lights often vanished, their names remembered only as examples in the next tavern tale. The chronicles of Spain and Portugal preserve accounts of silent lightning that played across the horizon, crackling without thunder, illuminating nothing, yet filling the night with uneasy glow. Mariners who steered toward such radiance often found themselves lost, their compasses spinning, their courses broken. Some never found their way again. The lights became known as the false dawns of the sea. Northern waters held omens of their own. In the fjords, men spoke of the seaglow, a strange radiance that rose from beneath the water, like the light of a hidden sun. It gleamed upon hulls, casting shadows upwards, so that ships seemed to sail upon air instead of water. Such visions, beautiful yet unsettling, were seen as harbingers of loss. Crews who lingered in that glow were said to vanish soon after, their boats drifting back empty, their men claimed by the radiance below. Even more dreaded were the voices. More than one chronicle speaks of nights when the wind carried faint songs, words half heard as if choirs sang just beyond the horizon. Some claimed they were the voices of drowned cities, others that they were sirens of the deep. Whatever their source, they lured sailors from their course. Ships that pursued the sound often vanished, their absence explained only by the memory of a song. Thus the omens of sky and sea joined whirlpools and storms in the ledger of vanishing. For what good was seamanship when the stars themselves betrayed? When the horizon bent into lies, when the sea glowed with ghostly light? These were not perils of wood and sail, but of perception itself, the sea twisting the senses until men walked willingly into its silence. And so the sailors lived not only in fear of storms and hunger, but in fear of the sea's lies. For to be deceived by water and sky was more terrible than to be crushed by waves, since it left no trace of resistance, only the certainty that men had followed false signs into silence. The memory of such omens sank deep into the marrow of seafaring life. It shaped their prayers, their rituals, and the charms they carried aboard. In every harbor, where ships rose tall above the quays, one could hear the murmur of words spoken against disappearance. Sailors spat upon the decks before casting off, for they said the sea would taste their defiance and be appeased. Mothers sewed threads of red into the hems of their sons' tunics, believing the color of blood might confuse the hunger of the waves. Wives slipped small tokens into their husbands' hands, shells, coins, pieces of blessed bread, each said to tether the soul to the living world, should the sea seek to steal it. Priests came to the quays and lifted hands in blessing. But even they confessed in whispers that their prayers often fell short upon the tide. Some monasteries kept candles burning perpetually for the unnamed, those lost not to storm nor plague, but to absence alone. In coastal chapels, votive ships hung upon walls, carved in wood or cast in tin, each an offering to the Virgin or to St. Nicholas, patron of sailors. Yet among these humble offerings there was always one ship left unclaimed, its name unwritten, waiting for the vessel that would not return. The sailors themselves devised charms more ancient still. They carved runes upon the mast, remnants of heathen faiths older than Christ. They tied knots in the rigging to hold fast the favor of the wind. Some painted eyes upon the prow, wide and watchful, that the ship might see dangers men could not. Others whispered secret names to the sea itself, as though to flatter its pride and coax its mercy. Yet none of these prevented the silence. The sea accepted the offerings but kept its law. In taverns, where the air was thick with smoke and the scent of brine, tales of vanishings were told with solemn cadence. The old sailors, with faces lined by salt and years, spoke not of victories, but of the ships that failed to return. They told of companions who had sailed beside them 1 hour and were gone the next, as though swallowed by unseen doorways and the air. They warned the young not to trust the glow upon the horizon, not to follow songs carried on the wind, not to believe that the ocean was ever still. For beneath stillness lay hunger, and beneath hunger lay silence. Yet for all the warnings men sailed still. For gold and honor, for duty and faith, they placed their trust in timbers and canvas, and in the hope that absence would pass them by. Each voyage was a prayer in motion, a wager cast upon the waves. Each return was a defiance of the silence, a brief victory carved against eternity. But the vanishings did not cease. They clung to every century, to every sea, like a tide that never ebbed. Some ships vanished in fleets, others alone. Some disappeared beneath storm, others in calm. Some returned as empty ghosts, others not at all. The ocean gave no answers, only questions repeated through the ages. And men, helpless before its vastness, could only weave those questions into story. For the sea was not merely water. It was memory without mercy, it was hunger without end, it was silence clothed in waves. And it held within its depths a scroll longer than all the chronicles of kings, the names of those who had sailed into its embrace and never returned. The coastlines themselves carried the weight of these memories, as if every cliff and shingle had learned to hold its breath. Headlands leaned like listening elders. Dunes kept the shape of footprints long after the walkers had gone. In creeks where boats were hauled out for tar and tending, one could trace in the scratches of old keels the long arithmetic of loss. Nets dried beside chapel walls, their knots resembling rosaries, for a faith that asked only that the sea relent. When a mast broke the horizon after long absence, the town exhaled. When none appeared, the very gulls seemed to wheel lower there. Cries drawn thin by waiting. There were coasts that answered absence with ritual. On a certain bay, where the tide ran far and fast, women gathered when the moon was young. They stood ankle-deep and sang a wordless hymn, lifting their skirts the way sailors lift a sail to test the wind. If the water, drawn by some old sympathy, rose to kiss their knees, they went home comforted, for it meant the sea was listening. If it fell away instead, they left bread upon the stones, believing the deep had turned its face. On another shore, men planted short poles of driftwood in a line from surf to turf, each pole carved with a name, and the sea took a man, his wife, unlashed her pole and cast it into the tide, trusting the water to bear at least the name back to its master. Some harbors spoke in signs rather than songs. A lantern left burning by day in a certain window meant a ship overdue. 2 windows lit meant a second vessel also missing. A third lantern was never lit, for by then the town had learned that signals cannot outrun sorrow. The baker wrapped loaves, smaller on such days, for grief makes little appetite. The smith quenched iron without the usual flourish, as if steam itself might carry unwelcome messages to the clouds, beyond the human margins. The sea kept staging its old catechisms. There were mornings when the horizon wore a narrow seam of gold that did not belong to the sun. By noon the seam had broadened into a pallor that lay upon the water like a thin skin, and ships within that expanse slowed as though a hand pressed upon their backs. There were afternoons when every swell seemed to breathe, not in the common rise and fall, but with a cadence that set a man's heart off-beat. Even the sure-footed stumbled, and seasoned captains tightened their jaws because there's no remedy for a rhythm wrongly shared. There were nights when sound traveled in strange straight lines. A bell far off rang, as if within arm's reach, while the creak of one's own timbers sounded absent, as if the ship had withdrawn a pace from its own body. Asterisk in such hours. The stories told themselves. A brace of merchantmen, alike in build and burden, kept station a cable length apart through 3 days of quiet. At dusk on the 4th, the nearer vessel's cook hung his pot as usual, grease feathering the air with homely promise. Aboard the companion ship, men laughed to smell it. After a time, one of them remarked perhaps too casually that he could no longer see smoke from the other galley. It was only the thinnest remark, for the light was fading and smoke hides itself in dusk. Yet before the watch was relieved, the companion's hull had drawn no nearer, though the course held true. By moonrise it was not too starboard but nowhere, and by dawn there was only a band of calm where her weight should have disturbed the world. Another telling spoke of a narrow sea between 2 islands that had always been safe by day and treacherous by night. So the pilots, cautious as bankmen, timed their passages with the sun. One autumn, after a run of losses elsewhere, a convoy elected to pass at noon under a sky clear as a polished coin. The first 3 ships went through with held breath and then laughter at their own superstition. The 4th entered the strait and seemed 2 eyes aboard the 5th, to lengthen for a heartbeat as boats will when a small swell lifts astern. Then she seemed to shorten, then too thin, and then she was simply wake without author. A ragged W written on the water that could not teach its letter twice. The 5th captain hove to. The 6th anchored in the very throat of tide. Both cried, "Out to the reefs to confess." The reefs had nothing to say. The pilots, who had sworn by daylight, grew old in an afternoon. Sometimes the sea returned tokens, as if to show that it could abate its secrecy without sacrificing an inch of sovereignty. A length of rope with a splice peculiar to a vanished crew, a plank planed by a left-handed carpenter known to all along. A coast. A small chest of tools, wrapped against rust by a thorough hand, washed onto a pebbled beach unbroken. As if the ocean admired such carefulness and sent it ashore for praise, These gifts were not explanations. They were courtesies. The people received them with the mixture of gratitude and resentment reserved for a messenger who brings only proof of loss, because the ocean would not speak. The land learned to imagine for it. On a headland west of any map's patience, old men swore that at certain low tides one could hear a long inhalation in a cave. A breath that seemed to begin before the world and end after it. Children misbehaved less in seasons when the breath was clear, and mothers spoke softer. In marshes where rivers negotiated their surrender, lights appeared at dusk and wrote patient letters upon the air. Readers differed as to the alphabet, but all admitted the hand was steady. On some nights the letters spelled salvation, on others they spelled sleep. On others they spelled nothing at all, which is the sea's favorite word. There were pilots who had outlived bravado and allowed themselves a private theology. One believed the ocean to be a scribe of inhuman patience, copying the day's events into a ledger of salt with a quill fashioned from moonlight. Most entries were small: a fish leaping, a cloud departing, a rope paid out, a woman on a cliff, lifting an ungloved hand toward a hole too far to see her. But now and then the scribe drew a long line and wrote a single name across it, and then smudged the name with his thumb so that the page showed only the wet trace of intention. Another pilot believed the sea to be a court where cases are called without counsel, and verdicts are given in the language of pressure. All appeals are heard at the bottom, and all are denied. But with a courtesy that shames the petitioner, the oldest mariners permitted themselves no doctrine, only craft. They learned to measure distances by the weight of silence between bellstrokes. They learned the taste of air before fog, the flat flavor that steals in ahead of wool. They learned to distrust a horizon too straight, for the world likes its lines a little imperfect. They taught their apprentices to count not merely time but attention, to let the eye fall upon the same corner of sail at the same minute of the same watch, day after day, so that any change, however delicate, would arrive like a trumpet. Such habits did not defeat vanishing, but they gave a man the dignity of meeting it awake. In winters, when harbors froze and ships were fettered to their moorings like horses to a bar, men and women gathered in lofts that smelled of hemp and pitch, and told again the most careful versions of the old tales. The careful versions were the ones that refused adornment. We sighted her at 2 points off the port bow. Shborso shansa kakula in her topsail. She answered our lantern twice, and then not again. It was harder, not easier. To believe such tales, their sobriety cutting like cold. Embellishment is a mercy one grants to the unbearable. Truth walks in without cloak. In summers that forgave a little, the sea allowed festivals to relieve the coil of grief. On a day chosen by tides and elders, every household set afloat a candle protected by a horn cup. The bay filled with small moving stars. From a bluff, if one squinted, one might pretend the constellations themselves had fallen into the water and were lying there like patient flowers. Children cheered. Lovers looked for omens in the way two lights drifted near and then apart. Old watched for patterns lines lost, circles made, a little knot of flames that stayed together against the push and pull. By morning the horn cups lay in windrows along the strand, brittle and milky, their wicks gone cold. There were always fewer than had been launched. No one counted. A century will sometimes decide to be kind and take fewer than its due. In such decades, the sea plays at lenience, returning derelicts promptly for burial, tossing up flotsam with legible initials, allowing wreckers to earn bread without lies. Then some hinge of weather shifts, some remote winter loosens a berg or warms a current, and the appetite returns keen as a first blade. Fleets thin. The best helmsman in a province grows too careful with his hands. Bells in 3 parishes take up a new habit of ringing on days when they are not called. The mapmaker leaves a little more margin at the edges of his sheet, though nothing in his commission authorizes a single blank. A traveler passing through such a season might ask what men and women feared most, and would be told, not storm, though. Storms are candid, nor hunger, though hunger's arguments are persuasive. They feared the unwitnessed hour, that beat on the string of time where a ship ceases to be a community and becomes a rumor. To be present at a death is to become its historian. To be denied the scene is to become its priest. The coastal world grew full of priests without vestments, conducting in their hearts the rites of what could not be narrated, so the epic lengthened without altering its theme. Names gathered like driftwood at the tide mark, each with a human grain, each scarred by use. Some were noble and heavy, others were light, plain and perfect for the hand. None of them stayed. The next tide made its clean argument, and the line of flotsam rearranged itself into a new sentence, one that looked for an instant like meaning and then, obedient to the oldest grammar, like sea. Night lays its cool coin on the brow of the water. Out beyond the familiar buoys, a small vessel makes her steady way. Her crew counts the soft breaths of canvas and answers them with the soft breaths of men at work. The stars hold to their stations with the fidelity of witnesses sworn. The wake breaks like paper, then mends behind her as all wounds and salt will. Within the compass bowl, a needle speaks in monosyllables, learned from mountains. On the far coast, a woman wakes at an hour with no number and knows, without knowing, that the tide has turned. She rises, steps to the door, and listens to the long inhalation of a world older than grief. She cannot hear the ship. The ship cannot hear her. Between them lies the unlit doctrine of the deep, the clause that is never changed. The one all sailors sign in their first sleep at sea. The ocean, who never hurries, keeps reading its book, aloud in the steady voice it prefers. It's chapter by chapter, the same plot and always a different cast. At times the voice lowers and tells of whirlpools and doors, of lights that are not lights and lands that are not lands. At times it brightens and recounts a safe passage, a reunion, a table laid in a kitchen that remembers salt only as seasoning. But sooner or later it returns to its favorite sentence, the one that has no verb and therefore cannot end. It lays that sentence upon the world like a calm, and the world, relieved and terrified, sleeps. And if one insists upon an answer upon a reason, a culprit, a hand at the latch of the unseen door, the sea offers its oldest courtesy. It curves, a little at the edge of sight, erases the chalk line of the day just enough to remind the eye that it is a guest, and whispers in the universal tongue of water against stone. The word it speaks is the same in every harbor, under every star, to every name carved upon every board. Hush. The hush of the sea was never empty. It was a chamber where echoes lived. Mariners said that if one leaned long enough over the gunwale, in a moonlit calm, the ocean would murmur back not in words, but in cadences that stirred memory. Some swore they heard the voices of companions lost, calling faintly through the rush of water. Others claimed to hear bells tolling from the deep or the clatter of oars that could not belong to any boat upon the surface. Whether truth or fancy, such whispers hardened into custom. Few men leaned over the side in stillness, for fear that the hush might speak too clearly. Asterisk villages answered the hush with their own language. On certain shores, when news of a missing vessel spread, the people did not weep aloud, but walked together to the edge of the tide and stood in silence, till the first wave touched their feet. Then they turned back without word, as if acknowledging a pact older than speech. Elsewhere, families left a chair empty at the table, not for mourning, but for vigilance. A reminder that absence must be hosted like any other guest. Candles burned in chapel windows night after night, though oil grew dear, until the sea itself seemed rimmed in tiny flames when looked upon from the heights. The hush carried outward, braided with the sky. Sailors grew wary of nights when the stars seemed to many, crowding upon one another until no line could be trusted. They spoke of starfalls, evenings when the heavens stooped low and men steered by patterns that led them astray. The voyage begun beneath such skies often ended in silence. Mariners kept records of these nights, marking them in logs with small signs, half-crosses, or circles, to warn those who would read them in years to come. Sometimes the sea revealed its appetite more openly. Convoy might pass through waters calm as glass, only to find, days later, that one vessel had failed to keep pace. No distress had been sighted, no storm encountered, no sail torn. It was as though the hush itself had taken form and swallowed the lagging ship. The remaining captains spoke little of it, for what words can explain a theft invisible? They wrote in their logs phrases of evasion, fell behind, failed to appear, presumed lost. But they knew what had happened. The sea had closed its hand. Derelicts drifted into harbors like unanswered questions. A hull, scarred but sound, its timbers still taut with pitch, slid into the tideway with no hand at the helm. Inside, all was orderly. Coils of rope, chests secured, provisions enough for weeks, yet no crew. The landfolk, seeing such vessels, crossed themselves and turned away. Some ships were left to rot at anchor, avoided by every sailor's eye. For to step aboard was to walk into the sea's silence. And many feared they would not walk out again. In time, the hush became part of the liturgy of life. Children were hushed at their mother's breast with words likening their sleep to the oceans. Old men, dying in their beds, whispered the same hush as they exhaled their final breath, as though yielding to the sea even from the land. When communities gathered to remember their vanished, they spoke no eulogies, but simply stood together, till silence itself became the prayer. The chronicles grew heavy with these unwritten hymns. Parchment could not carry them, for absence is a burden too vast for ink. Yet the sea kept its own record, inscribed in tides and currents, and stars bent slightly from their courses, and bells heard faintly on nights when no bell was rung. The hush endured, teaching every generation that to live beside the ocean was to live beside mystery, and that to sail upon it was to sign one's name in a book that might never be read again. And still men went. They caulked their hulls, mended their sails, and set forth with songs on their lips. For the hunger of the world, the longing for land, for wealth, for glory was stronger than fear. They sailed, though they knew the sea might silence them. They sailed, though their names might join the long litany of the vanished. They sailed because to remain ashore was to deny the very call that made them human. The hush learned new dialects. As it moved from coast to coast, archipelagos, where coral wrote its pale script just beneath the surface. The silence tasted of lime and sun, and men spoke of lagoons that became mirrors too perfect to trust. In estuaries, where brown rivers unrolled themselves into the sea like bolts of cloth, the silence wore the smell of silt, and barges entering the tide found themselves slipping sidewise as if the ocean took them by the elbow and led them politely. Elsewhere, in the long throats of fjords, the hush was a cold bell. In southern gulfs, it was warm as breath. But always it meant the same thing, the border between the counted world and the world that refuses numbers. Sheikh or says, who loved straightedges the way sailors love wind, tried to teach the hush to sit still. They inked coastlines with the schoolmasters. Patience and set triangles of bearing across the pages like small, obedient ladders. They chased phantom capes to their extinction and retired bold islands to the drawer where heirs sleep. Yet at the edges of their work, the ink always thinned into white, and the white into guesswork, and the guesswork into a silence nothing could abbreviate. Some cartographers, pious in their pride, left that margin naked. Others, more honest, drew a soft wash there as if to say, here the sea begins to speak in its own handwriting. Seasons taught their lessons with the same old rigor. In spring, sailors trusted the high scud in the pale, hurrying light. In summer, they courted calms, with offerings of song and patience. Autumn gave them the noble theater of storms, those loud, legible sermons in which cause and effect wear names. Winter, when the water darkened until it seemed to absorb even thought, returned them to the alphabet of vanishing, for it is not the cold that steals men, but the multiplication of darkness by distance, and that arithmetic belongs to winter once. In the memory of a coast that keeps its stories in the knots of driftwood, a town sent out 3 boats on a tide remembered, as favorable by everyone who saw it. The crews had quarreled the night before and made up properly at dawn, with bread shared and a joke repeated to prove its harmlessness. Each boat carried a charming iron nail pressed into the mast, a wisp of a mother's hair in the captain's pocket, a scrap of ribbon at the tiller. The boats stood out one behind another like syllables in a child's first word. By dusk, a squall should have roughed the bay, but it did not. By moonrise, a line of chop should have shown where wind met. River, but none appeared. The following noon, the first boat drifted in, neat as a proverb. The second grounded on the bar, as gently as a kiss. The third never returned at all. The town learned with the clarity of hunger that silence has varieties. The silence that leaves a hole. The silence that leaves a mark, and the silence that leaves nothing. Far offshore, among long blue sentences. Of swell, a convoy once kept in exacting company. Each morning the lead ship struck a note on her bell of courtesy. Not a signal land each morning, as decorum required. The others answered. On the seventh day the bell was struck, and a pause fell, which nobody recognized as new until it was old. The second and third ships answered. The fourth did not. The fifth hesitated, then mocked up the missing tone with a liar's hope. The lead, obeying protocols older than any admiral, turned through a careful arc to take the roll of her companions with the eye of a shepherd. Where the fourth should have worn the sun as a coin upon her quarter, there was only water with the bright rubbed off. The lead marked her book with the smallest mark it could hold, and returned to course. For grief is heavy. Fleet cannot carry much of it without wrecking. Harbors collected such accounts the way trees collect wind. Old men told them with the reluctance of surgeons, cleanly and without flourish. Children learned to listen without questions, because questions made the tale less true. Among the women, who counted time by bread and by the fading of colors and cloth hung to dry, there grew a literature of gestures, the way one folded a shawl over a chair back when the chair would not be used again. The way one opened a door, fingers width near noon, on days when a ship was due. The way one turned away from the water when the gulls began to argue with the calm. Against the hush they set these small defenses, knowing they would not save a single hull, but also knowing that a soul, like a ship, needs a proper trim to meet whatever current comes. When the moon climbed full and deliberate, the sea answered, with its tidiest handwriting. Sandbars wrote themselves in cursive. Ripples combed hair into the backs of coves. Kelp signed its dark name across the laps of rocks. On such nights the vanished seemed nearest. Not in phantoms those wasteful extravagances of grief nor invoices, which the sober distrust, but in the angle of a star that sits half a finger lower than it did in childhood, and in the way the smell of pitch from an idle yard will throw a man to his knees with gratitude for a return that has not occurred and will not occur. The living have their own vanishings performed on land. The priests, who knew the price of words, did with them only what they could bear to answer for. They read from the Psalms that speak kindly to water and laid their hands upon the shoulders of those who had no shoulders left to warm. In a few sea chapels, a practice survived from times with shorter names. Once a year, the congregation stepped down into the tide in their Sunday boots and walked until the cold taught them reverence. There they spoke aloud the list of the missing, each name pronounced as if it were just now embarking, each syllable given the space we give to a sail that must fill. When the list was finished, the priest said only enough. The congregation answered, Amen, which being translated means, so be the silence. Of explanations, the coast had plenty and believed none. There were gases that rose invisibly and made a soft theft of breath. There were magnets in the earth's black bones that coaxed needles into scandal. There were mouths in the ocean floor that opened politely and took what was offered. There were the old and delicate gods who hate pride and love salt. Each account fitted some edge and failed another. The hush welcomed them all impartially and altered its shape for none. Men carried the theories like talismans and lost them as they lost knives and caps. The sea, which has no pockets, kept only what it always keeps, names, hours. The clean shape of a hole last seen toward dawn. When watchmen's thoughts grow frayed and the first birds hazard their unmusical devotions, the surface often shows its simplest face. A plain is a mercy. Ships write their bright lines upon it, and the script lies legible for a heartbeat longer than at noon. The last star withdraws. The wind signs its compact with the day. And always someone remembers to be grateful for the thickness of rope, the honesty of wood, the narrow generosity of canvas. Gratitude is the only instrument the sea has never unstrung. And so the story keeps its gait. Oars shipped, sails raised, anchors broken out and set down again. Candles lit and blown dark, bells struck and unanswered. Ledgers open to the page where numbers add and then stop. The ocean, making no promises, and breaking none, passes a cool hand over the brow of each century and takes its due. We, who stand at the edge with our coats buttoned against whatever weather is fashionable, tell the tale as carefully as we can and leave the rest to the grammar. Of water, if there is a moral, it is not victory, nor even warning, but attention. Attend to the small noises, the honest hinge, the halyard's modest song. Attend to the way a horizon makes a thought longer. Attend to names while they are near enough to answer. For the hush is coming as certain as flood, as courteous as EBB, and when it arrives, it will ask only what it has always asked, that we listen. It's listening. Remember, the hush was never still for long. It shifted like a tide in thought. By day it could be patient, lying upon the water like a sheet uncreased, allowing men to forget themselves in labor and song. But by night it deepened, it leaned close, it listened too carefully. Ain't many a watchman, standing alone at the rail, felt its nearness in the marrow as though an unseen ear waited just beyond the black. Some swore the hush carried weight, pressing upon the timbers, upon the lungs, as if silence itself were a sea heavier than water. A few muttered that it was not absence at all, but presence unspoken. Whole coasts lived by such belief. On the rugged cliffs of Ireland, it was said, the hush carried the voices of Hy-Brasil, the isle that rose from the sea only once in 7 years. Men who dared chase it vanished, their ships never seen again, their names added to the long chant of the missing. In Brittany, widows sat upon the strand on certain nights, claiming they could hear the drowned calling their husbands' names from beneath the hush. They did not answer, for to answer was to follow. Yet still they listened, for silence without echo was more unbearable than silence with ghosts. Further north, the fjords told darker tales. There the hush came not as stillness, but as song. At dusk, when the sun slid behind cliffs black as anvils, the sea's breath rose in low chords, and fishermen swore the voices were not human. Nets hauled in such music often came up empty, or else full of fish to pale to live long. Worse still, some boats never returned. Villages said the hush had chosen its tithe, drawing men down into its choir. To the east, the Baltic kept its own covenant. In winter, when ice locked the harbors, people said they could hear faint bells ringing beneath their feet, as though drowned cities still kept time below. When spring thawed the waters, fleets departed again, but always with trepidation, for the hush had told their names already. Some returned scarred, some limped home in halves, but others dissolved into absence, their bells joining the choir of the deep. Even the wide Atlantic bore omens of hush in its vastness. Mariners wrote of nights when the stars themselves fell quiet, dimming in their stations until the sky was less map than void. The sea below mirrored that emptiness, dark and depthless, and ships drifted as if on ink. Crews whispered that the hush was no longer in the air, but in the water, a silence so thick it swallowed sound before it left the throat. On such nights, men spoke with gestures only, lest words themselves be taken. Often at dawn, one vessel was gone, vanished as thoroughly as a candle pinched between fingers. And yet through all of this, through phantom islands and drowned bells, through singing fjords and starless nights, men kept sailing. For though the hush claimed fleets, it also spared others. No sailor believed he would be the chosen sacrifice until the sea proved him wrong. They lifted anchors with trembling hands, crossed themselves at the bow, and set out upon the tide, knowing the silence waited, yet refusing to yield to it until compelled. Thus the hush became not only omen, but companion. It lived in the rigging, in the pause between bells and the breath before prayer. It taught men humility greater than any storm, for it struck not with roar, but with stillness. And in that stillness, entire centuries were unmade. their ships and men and stories folded into the sea's eternal memory. The ocean's book grew heavier with each vanishing, its pages not of paper but of tide, its ink not of pigment but of absence. And as empires rose and fell, the hush endured, patient as stone, writing its scripture of silence across every coast, every fleet, every name. So it was that the hush became not a single tale, but 100, not a single sea, but all seas together. Sailors carried it with them as one carries a shadow into the warm Atlantic swells, into the green chop of the Channel, into the black reaches of the Indian Ocean. It needed no geography. It walked wherever the water walked. Men who love order sought always to pin it down. They said, "Here lies the cursed passage, here the silent shoals, here the road of vanishing." But the hush obeyed no boundaries, and to trust too much in lines of ink was to invite betrayal. Chronicles tell of convoys where the hush moved among ships like a thief. One would be taken, while the others sailed on unaware until dawn showed a gap in the line. Captains swore they had seen their comrades, lanterns burning at midnight, steady as their own, yet by morning the lantern and the mast that bore it were gone. No sound of struggle, no splash of timber, only the unmarked sea. These absences gnawed at the hearts of the survivors more than storms ever could, for storms at least left wreckage and reason. Silence left only self-doubt. Had they truly seen the lantern? Had the ship ever been there at all? In one account from a northern log, 3 merchantmen kept watch upon one another for safety. Each hour they raised a flag or struck a bell to reassure the rest. For 6 days the ritual was flawless. On the 7th morning, the second ship struck no bell. The other 2 hailed her with horns and lanterns, but no answer came. Yet her sails were seen filled with wind, her hull moving fair. They approached and found the decks empty, the rigging neat, the helm tied firm. Cargo and provisions lay untouched. The vessel sailed on as if she needed no men. The 2 remaining captains argued long whether to tow her, but dread overcame duty. They loosed her to the sea, and when next they looked back, she had vanished into a bank of mist. Neither ship nor ghost of her was ever sighted again. Such tales bred fear of companionship itself. Some said the hush preferred to work in company, to set men against their own senses by stealing what lay nearest. Fleets grew wary, captains mistrustful of their own eyes, yet no caution availed, for whether they sailed alone or in convoy, under prayer or under silence, the sea's hand could reach them. On certain coasts, folk believed the hush chose its victims not by chance but by design. They spoke of names whispered in the night wind, of ships that were called one by one into the deep. Sailors swore they had heard their vessel's name spoken from the black water, in tones no human throat could make. Some clapped their hands. Over their ears, others leaped into prayer. But always the named ship was the one that failed to return, whether by storm, by silence, or by vanishing entire. The prophecy fulfilled itself. No chronicle could prove such things, yet the records are heavy with coincidence. A ship blessed more fervently than her sisters would be the one lost. A captain who scoffed at the hush would be the one to vanish. A fleet that joked too loudly in calm weather would find itself thinned by morning. And so belief hardened into law: never mock the silence, never boast against the tide. Never speak lightly of the vanished, for the hush has ears. Still the trade of nations pressed on. Silver and spice, wool and wine, slaves and soldiers, all were ferried upon waters known to claim their tithe. Empires expanded, colonies grew, but always the sea took back its share. Kings counted their treasure in gold, but the ocean counted its treasure in names. And though the gold was locked in vaults, the names sank deeper, beyond recall, into the hush that endures beneath every wave. Thus the sea kept its dominion, older than empire, older than prayer. It granted passage, but never promise. It taught men to hope, but never to presume. And in its silence, it held the stories of the vanished, writing them not in ink, but in absence, not on parchment, but on water, where no hand could turn the page. And so the chronicles turned again to the strangest returns of all, vessels that came back not wrecked, not broken, but emptied of their breath. These were the ships that slid into harbors, with sails still catching wind, with timbers sound, with cargo stacked as carefully as the day it was stowed, yet with no hand to guide the rudder, no voice upon the deck. Such derelicts were feared more than storms, for they were proof that the sea could take the living and leave behind the shell, a cruel relic to taunt those who waded ashore. Fishermen, sighting one adrift, often turned their prows away, preferring ignorance to knowledge. Merchantmen, bound by duty, sometimes approached to board, and those who climbed across the silent gunwales swore they felt a weight, not of cargo, but of watching. Cabins stood in order, food laid ready, cups still upright, charts unrolled, yet not a soul. Some found a pipe still warm, a candle guttering low, a seamstress's needle thrust halfway into cloth, all the marks of life and life absent. These ships were treated as cursed. Once towed back, they were examined with anxious care, priests summoned to sprinkle salt and prayer, but the dread of the void clung to them. Few would sail them again. Most were left to rot at anchor, dismantled in silence, their timbers reused only by the bold or the desperate. For it was said that whatever had taken the crew still walked the decks, unseen, waiting for new names to claim. Legends clothed these husks in many garments. Some said the men had been called overboard by voices sweeter than song, lured one by one into the deep, until only timbers remained. Others believed that storms invisible to the eye had swept across the deck, not of wind and rain but of spirit, lifting souls from flesh as wind lifts leaves. A few whispered of doors opening between worlds, pulling crews through into seas beyond sight, leaving their vessels to drift like discarded skins. Whatever the cause, the effect was terror. For if storms shattered, if reefs tore, if cannon fire destroyed, all these were honest enemies. But a ship intact, abandoned by its living heart, that was mockery. It was the hush-given form, absence wrapped in wood and sail. To behold such, a vessel was to behold one's own doom in rehearsal. The tales multiplied. A brig found drifting near Biscay, her decks scrubbed, her cargo sealed, her galley fire newly quenched. A fishing fleet in the Baltic, its boats tied neatly together, sails lowered, nets folded, yet no men. A merchantman that glided back into the very harbor she had left, anchor dropped, gangplank lowered, but not a soul to walk it. Each story entered the annals, written with a hand that trembled between fact and fear, and still the sea gave no answer. No survivor returned to explain, no wreckage to accuse. Only the vessels, ghostly in their perfection, served as witnesses. They said nothing. But their silence was heavier than any testimony. Thus ghost ships became sermons of absence, floating scriptures that taught without words. They warned every sailor that no prayer, no seamanship, no steel could promise return. They reminded the world that the sea could claim not only life, but the very trace of it. And when such a ship was sighted, every heart on the water quailed, for it was proof that the hush did not only erase, it could leave behind a mocking echo, an empty frame, and in that frame, every sailor saw himself. So the whispers grew of not merely single vessels adrift, but whole fleets that sailed without men. Mariners swore that now and then, upon horizons pale with mist, they glimpsed a procession of sails, torn, tattered, yet still aloft, moving against the wind as though drawn by some other tide. Lanterns swung upon their yards, faint as dying stars, but no voices answered the hail. To follow was useless, for the ghostly armada never drew nearer nor fell astern. It kept its own pace, belonging neither to sea nor sky, as if pinned to the fabric of another world. The Dutch spoke of a wandering convoy seen near the Cape. 3 merchantmen, in perfect line, their hulls gleaming with unnatural sheen. They bore no ensign, gave no reply, and when a brave captain tried to close the distance, his own compass began to whirl in circles, his needle trembling as if drunk. At dawn the ships had melted into the haze, leaving behind only the smell of pitch and the shiver of fear. He returned to Amsterdam with his cargo intact, but his eyes hollow, for he swore the fleet he had seen were the lost Indiamen of his own company, gone 20 years before. The Spanish whispered of a treasure fleet that never made Seville, yet was seen centuries later in the Sargasso, drifting in solemn order with sails yellowed but unbroken. The galleons, rich with silver and gold, gleamed like reliquaries of the deep. Fishermen who told the tale said they dared not draw close, for the sea around the fleet was slick as oil, no wind stirring within its bounds. They fled, and when they looked back, the ships had vanished, as if swallowed by the horizon, in the north. English sailors told of the Grey Squadron, 6 ships that glided together in silence. To see them was omen. One's own voyage would end in loss, perhaps not at once but soon, for the squadron was said to be a herald of the sea's appetite. Some swore the Grey Squadron was composed of ships lost from every nation, gathered into one wandering brotherhood of absence, condemned to sail forever as warning. Not all accounts spoke of dread alone. A few told of hope, of sailors lost, who appeared in dreams to their kin, saying they sailed still upon seas unmarred by storm, where the stars burned brighter and the waves bore them gently. These visions, rare and tender, gave comfort to the grieving, though most believed them only the mercy of sleep. Yet even these gentle tales carried unease, for they implied that the vanished were not gone, but bound to endless voyaging, unable to touch land again. The phantom fleets became part of every coast's mythology. Mothers warned their children not to point at strange sails, lest the ghostly crews take offense and claim another name. Priests preached that such visions were temptations, lures of the devil to draw men into madness. Sailors, though, had their own interpretation, that the sea, in its strange justice, sometimes revealed what it had taken not to answer, but to remind. For if a single ghost ship was mockery, then a fleet of them was judgment. It was the sea, showing men how many names it had already erased, how many families it had already unmoored. To see such a fleet was to glimpse the ocean's ledger in procession. The drowned paraded not in coffins, but in silence. And always, after such sightings, vanishings multiplied. Ships that sailed confidently into familiar waters did not return. Fleets expected with harvest or with silver were struck from the records. It was as though the phantom fleets were collectors, coming ahead of the tide to announce the debt about to be paid. Thus the oceans filled not only with stories of absence, but with the shadows of what once was present. Armadas of silence moved across the seas, seen and unseen, reminders that the ocean's hunger was endless, that all who sailed upon it did so under the gaze of the ghostly host, and still men sailed. For gold and empire, for hunger and faith, for the dream of land beyond the horizon, yet in their hearts they knew they did not sail upon the sea alone. They sailed in the company of the vanished. They said there were corridors of water where the ghostly processions most often walked, as though the vanished had chosen their own invisible trade routes across eternity. In the mid-Atlantic, near the weed-choked calm of the Sargasso, men feared to look too long, for pale sails were glimpsed there more than anywhere else. The seaweed clung to hulls like grasping hands, and in its stillness, a silence deeper than calm prevailed. Sailors whispered that the Sargasso was not merely a sea of weeds, but a harbor of the lost, where fleets gone missing waited in spectral anchorage. Their crews condemned to stand eternal watch, to the north among the fogs of the Grand Banks. Phantom squadrons were said to ride the mist, their masts rising like bare trees above the white. Fishermen, accustomed to the cry of gulls, grew uneasy when the fog fell utterly quiet, for then the Grey Squadron might be passing. Sometimes a bell was heard faintly, swinging in rhythm with no visible hand. Sometimes the creak of rigging came. Across the water, though, no ship was seen. Those who returned from such encounters did so pale and silent, for they knew another name had been added to the ledger of absence in the northern straits of Scandinavia, where the tides run fierce between cliffs. The great maelstrom was feared not only for its hunger, but for the company it kept. Mariners claimed that, on nights of certain moons, sails could be seen circling within its spiral, ships endlessly turning, never sinking, never escaping. They were the crews once claimed by the whirlpool, now condemned to circle forever in its grasp. To glimpse them was to feel the pull of the vortex even from miles away. and to know that the sea marked one's own hole for remembrance further south. In the warm waters near the Azores, islanders spoke of entire fleets passing beneath the waves. Divers swore they saw masts beneath the surface on bright days, stretching downward like forests, though no wreck was charted there. "They are the drowned, sailing still," the old men said. But on a sea below our sea, such stories frightened children, but sailors carried them like secret knowledge. For every man who shipped out knew that the second sea waited beneath him, a mirror world ready to claim his name. Even the Indian Ocean bore its ghostly convoys. Arab pilots told of ranks of lanterns strung across the horizon where no fleet should be. They moved in perfect order, brighter than stars, and then extinguished all at once, leaving the sea in darkness. Some believed these lights were jinn, mocking the ambitions of empires. Others said they were the souls of sailors who had vanished in storms, sailing still in caravans unseen by land. Whatever their nature, they were feared as omens, for after such lights appeared, storms often followed, or silence fell upon one or more vessels in the convoy. The Pacific, boundless and inscrutable, had its own legends. Polynesian navigators spoke of phantom canoes, great fleets that crossed the moonlit horizon in utter stillness. They carried no paddlers, made no sound, but glided swift as thought. To see them was to know that ancestors walked the sea that night, and that someone among the living would not see the next dawn. The vastness of that ocean made such tales believable, for who could say what moved upon its endless skin? All these ghostly convoys, from the Sargasso to the Pacific, carried one truth: the vanished did not rest. They sailed still, unseen companions to every voyage, their silence heavier than storm. Some called them warnings, others called them guardians, but all agreed they were reminders that the sea had a longer memory than man. And so every sailor, as he took his place at the rail, glanced off into the horizon, watching for sails too, pale lanterns too steady, lines too perfect in their silence. To see them was to know the ocean's hunger, and to feel that the ghostly fleet had drawn near to count the living. For the sea is never empty. It is crowded with absence, and the vanished sail forever upon it. Then the tales deepened still further, for not only ships but whole cities were said to dwell beneath the waves. The ocean, men whispered, had its own kingdoms, built not of stone, and would but of silence and memory. When the sea claimed too many lives from one coast, the people believed it was feeding its drowned cities, filling streets invisible with sailors and fishermen who would never walk the land again. Along the Breton shore in the old land of Armorica, the legend of Ease was told in every harbor tavern. A city of splendor, they said, with walls of gold and spires that caught the dawn. Ease had grown proud and wicked, and the sea had risen to swallow it. Yet its bells still tolled beneath the tide, heard on calm nights when the wind lay flat. Swore that lights sometimes gleamed far offshore, as if the drowned streets were still lit by lanterns. Many a boat steered toward those glimmers, hoping for safe harbor, and never returned. To this day, Breton wives spoke of the bells of Ease as warning, a summons none must follow, for to heed them was to join the vanished. On the Baltic coast, monks in cold cloisters recorded the same wonder in sterner words. Day wrote of Veneta, the great city drowned for its greed. On storm nights, bells rang beneath the waves, and the chanting of ghostly choirs rose through the foam. Villagers said they had seen towers shimmering beneath the surface when the tide ran low and the light struck at a slant. Children were warned that if they gazed too long, the sea would remember their names. And ships that ventured too near were often lost, no wreckage ever returning. As though the drowned citizens demanded new companions, Ireland and Scotland, too, told their own versions. There, the phantom isle of Hy-Brasil drifted across the horizon like a mirage. Once every 7 years it rose from the sea, green and fertile, crowned with shining halls. Many a bold captain turned his prow toward it, lured by its promise. Sailed for days, the isle always just ahead, until they vanished utterly, never to be sighted again. Others claimed to reach it, but when they set foot upon its shores, the land dissolved into mist, leaving their ships adrift and unmanned. In later years, sailors said Hy-Brasil was no true island, but a doorway, lure cast by the sea to gather men into its drowned dominions. Further south, in the Mediterranean, Genoese pilots whispered of an isle west of Sardinia where a whole fleet, once landed, never to depart. The isle was marked on charts for a generation, then removed when no one else could find it. Yet sailors swore its bells rang beneath the surf, and more than one vessel was drawn toward phantom lights upon its shore, only to vanish like the first. Venetians, cautious and shrewd, marked such places with symbols of death, steering wide. But even their care could not spare every hole. The legends reached beyond Europe. Along the West African coast, people spoke of the city of Meru, whose great bronze bells, seized in war, were cast into the sea. Still they rang when storms rose, tolling like thunder beneath the tide. To hear them was omen, for after such tollings, ships were often lost. Arab sailors told of Zerzura, the drowned city of the Red Sea, whose lamps shone faintly at night, luring dhows into silence. And in the vast Pacific, islanders spoke of ancestral villages swallowed by waves, their drums still beating beneath the moonlit surf, summoning the living to join them. What united these tales was not their detail, but their dread. For whether city or isle, bells or drums, the sea was believed to remember, to echo, to reach upward with sounds no human hand made. And those who listened too closely risked being named by the silence, taken into it. The drowned places became companions to the ghost fleets, eternal reminders that the sea was not merely emptiness, but a world of its own, peopled with all it had stolen. The rituals of the living reflected this belief. In Brittany, mothers hushed children with the warning, "Hear you the bells of ease, then stay within." In Venetta's shadow, whole towns poured wine into the surf at midsummer, an offering to appease the unseen citizens below. In Ireland, when High Brazil's day drew near, wives forbade their men from sailing westward, though some went anyway, chasing gold and wonder, and their names were written only in silence. Even in the Mediterranean, sailors made the sign of the cross when false. Lights glimmered on the horizon, praying they would not be summoned. And still, despite prayers and warnings, ships vanished. The chronicles of drowned bells and phantom cities did not end in one century or another. They stretched unbroken, each age adding its own verse. For though men changed their ships, their sails, their gods, the sea kept its silence. Its bells tolled unseen. Its lights gleamed faintly, its ghostly streets filled with new names. For what is a city, if not the memory of its people? And what is the ocean, if not the greatest city of all, built of absences, paved with silence, lit by the faint gleam of vanished fleets, drifting forever in procession? And thus the story flowed on, from the ghost convoys above to the drowned citadels below, each answering the other, each reminding mankind that to live by the sea was to live beside eternity. Chat GPT G Noi, then the chronicles turned there. Gaze once more to the fleets of empire, those proud armadas swollen with riches that never saw their homeward shores. For if ghostly derelicts and drowned cities were the sea's whispers, then the vanished treasure fleets were its thunder, whole convoys erased. As if the ocean wished to show kings and emperors that all crowns were light against its patience. In Seville's ledgers there are blank lines where silver should have been counted. The scribes' cautious men wrote only, "Lost at sea." Behind those two words hid the weight of entire fleets, vessels bristling with cannon and prayer, filled with gold and emeralds that might have altered kingdoms. Families in Andalusia lit candles, for sons who would never walk through their doors again. Priests intoned masses without coffins, for no bodies had been returned. Yet the Atlantic kept its silence, sealing the treasure in a vault no diver could breach. The Portuguese felt the same wound. Their carracks, proud as fortresses, carried the wealth of the Indies, silk and spice that could perfume a city. Yet the ocean's hand was impartial. The Flor du Mar, heavy with Malacca's spoils, was last seen straining upon the Indian Ocean swells, and then she was gone. Not a beam, not a coin, not a whisper of wreckage. Some said she lay hidden intact in the caverns of the sea, guarded, by silence. Others believe she had sailed into another world entirely, where the sun burned with stranger light. For centuries men dreamed of finding her, but she never returned. The Dutch merchants of precision measured absence as carefully as profit. Their East Indiamen, built stoutly for long voyages, departed Batavia in fleets. Yet time and again, one or two ships failed to appear at the Cape. The survivors spoke of calm seas, of stars bright and faithful, nothing to explain the vanishing. "We looked astern," one pilot wrote, "and where her lantern should have been, there was only the horizon." The Dutch recorded the loss in their ledgers with sober ink, but sailors told a different tale, that false stars had guided their companions into corridors of silence. Phantom shores had risen and swallowed them whole. Even England, bold in its reach, suffered the ocean's erasure. Vessels bound for Virginia, their holds filled with bread, salt meat, and hope, never reached the hungry colonists. Ships bound for the Indies melted into absence between one sighting and the next. For the families left ashore, grief was not tempered by wreckage. No mast washed up, no chest drifted home. Only the ache of the horizon and the silence that followed, and with every fleet that vanished, legends grew thicker. Men swore the sea kept all its prizes intact, locked in hidden palaces beneath the waves. There the Flor du Mar still gleamed with Malacca's gold, where the galleons of Spain stood in solemn rows, their silver undimmed by salt. There the East Indiamen of Holland slept in silence, their porcelain still stacked in perfect towers. The drowned crews, pale and wordless, kept watch upon the treasure. Guardians of an empire no king could claim. Others whispered that such fleets were not buried, but transported, that they sailed still upon some mirror ocean, bound by a sky of unfamiliar stars. Sailors claimed a dream of them, whole convoys moving silently across a midnight sea, crews staring ahead with eyes that no longer belonged to the living. To wake from such a dream was to wake in fear, for it meant the sea had brushed against one's own soul. Yet kings continued to send their fleets. Ambition weighed heavier than dread. For every treasure fleet that vanished, another set sail, trusting prayer and iron to defy the silence. Some returned rich, others limped home battered, but enough were lost that the hush grew louder with every century. The ocean's ledger of absence swelled, and its script was always the same: no wreckage, no witness, no return. And so the great treasure fleets joined the roll of ghost ships in drowned cities. Their loss was not only in gold, but in memory. For each erasure was a wound in history. To this day their names are spoken not as tales of battle or storm, but as silences too deep for parchment. They remind us that the sea, indifferent to empire, keeps the balance. For every crown, a coffin. For every conquest, a void. The rumors of lost treasure grew like ivy upon the walls of every seaport. Sailors could not speak of vanished fleets without weaving in the glimmer of gold and silver, sleeping somewhere beneath the waves. In taverns from Lisbon to Amsterdam, the hush itself was given weight by the thought of chests still sealed, coins still stacked, jewels still burning with fire in the dark. The Spaniards told of a convoy, 7 galleons strong, that had sailed from Havana, heavy with silver from the mines of Potosi. They were sighted once, their sails white upon the Atlantic swell, and then never again. Years passed, and fishermen swore that in calm weather they could see faint shadows beneath the waves, outlines of ships still whole, their masts reaching up like drowned trees. Some said the sea displayed them on purpose, a cruel reminder of what it had claimed. To dream of those galleons was to wake with salt upon the lips, as though one had been breathing the water of their eternal grave. The Portuguese whispered of the bomb Jesus, bound for India, that slipped into the fog and was never sighted after. No storm was marked, no enemy prowled those waters. She had simply gone, leaving families in Lisbon to wait at windows that opened only onto silence. Traders said her cargo of ivory and coin was still out there, resting in halls beneath the Indian Ocean. They spoke of it not as loss, but as a secret kept by the sea, richer than any vault of king or pope. The Dutch, meticulous record keepers, haunted themselves with their own precision. In Batavia's ledgers, whole voyages are noted. Provisions tallied, crew's name, cargoes described in detail. Then a line breaks off into nothing, and across the margin is written one word only. Verdwanen, vanished. The merchants spoke in coin, but the sailors spoke in awe. The sea took her whole, they said, as if swallowing a thought before it could be spoken. The lost Indiamen became phantoms, said to return in fog as pale companions to the living. The English added their verse to the litany. Ships bearing the lifeblood of their colonies, provisions for hungry settlements across the ocean, were erased. Mid-journey. In the New World, desperate eyes scanned the horizon. In the Old, families clutched unopened letters. Both sides were left with absence. Yet in taverns, men consoled themselves with the story that those ships had found some hidden shore. A paradise the sea revealed only once, where crews feasted forever and never hungered. It was kinder to believe them alive in secret than to face. The hushed legends grew that the sea was not simply devouring, but collecting. That somewhere beneath lay a court more splendid than any on land. Its halls furnished with timbers unrotted, its floors paved with silver bars, its walls hung with silks kept dry by miracle. There the drowned kings of ships sat in council, their eyes pale, their voices gone, ruling an empire of absence. Mariners swore that when storms moaned with peculiar tone, it was the choir of that drowned court rising to remind the living of its dominion. Others imagined stranger fates. They said the treasure fleets had not sunk, but slipped sideways into seas that ran parallel to ours. In those seas, the ships still sailed, but beneath alien constellations, never reaching a shore. To dream of them was to feel the role of phantom. Decks beneath one's feet, the creak of rigging without a crew. Some who dreamed so vividly awoke changed, their eyes distant, as though part of them had remained aboard. And yet, for every tale of vanished wealth, kings still loaded their galleons. Merchants still entrusted their cargoes, and sailors still climbed the rigging. For the promise of fortune weighed heavier than fear, and ambition was deaf to silence. But beneath every voyage lingered the knowledge that the sea had already written the ending. Whether in gold delivered to port or in treasure locked forever, in its vault of absence, thus the treasure fleets joined the ghostly squadrons, the drowned cities, the phantom isles. They became another stanza in the great hymn of loss, sung by the ocean in a voice of hush. Each age added its verse, each coast carried its echo, until the sea was less a highway than a scripture of silence, and all who sailed upon it knowingly, or not, became its pilgrims. So the chronicles gathered not only names of ships, but of places, for certain waters grew darker with reputation than others. Sailors said that the ocean had corridors of hunger, regions where vanishings gathered like storms and where the hush walked more heavily than elsewhere. Among these, none was more feared than the warm Atlantic between the isles of Bermuda, Puerto Rico, and Florida, a sea that in later centuries would be named, but which long before was already dreaded as a mouth of silence. Their pilots swore. Compasses twisted without cause, their needles trembling like frightened birds. Lights appeared upon the horizon, green and dancing, then slid beneath the waves as if mocking pursuit. Ships departed Havana in fair weather and were never seen again. It is not the storm that takes them, a chronicler wrote, but something quieter, for the sky was clear and the sea calm, and yet they were gone. Mariners gave the region no single name, but all knew its boundaries by heart. And when they sailed through, their songs grew hushed and their prayers more urgent. The legends multiplied. Some said vast mouths opened beneath the water, swallowing ships whole with neither wreck nor cry. Others believed the very sky bent there, folding the horizon into false lines that led men astray. Still others whispered of lights beneath the surface, moving in ranks as though an army marched unseen upon the seabed. Whatever the cause, the effect was the same. Fleets dissolved, names erased, silence thickened, the Bermuda waters gained. A fame more feared than any reef or cape. Nor was the dread confined to the New World, far to the north. Along the Weser River, the Segelhorst carried its own shadow. It was a quieter story, told not of empires, but of merchants. A fleet of grain ships set out one morning, their sails bright, their decks orderly. They were sighted at the river mouth, their masts a proud procession against the sky. Yet they never reached the sea. No wreck drifted back, no man returned. In monastery records, a scribe wrote with shaking hand, "They were seen, they were counted, they were gone." From that day the name Segelhorst was spoken with caution, as if it were itself a spell. Other waters carried lesser but no less fearful reputations. In the Baltic, sailors warned of the White Road, where mists gathered in every season. Boats that entered often returned adrift and empty, their nets folded neat, their sails lowered, their men erased. In the Indian Ocean, pilots spoke of currents that coiled into knots, dragging even strong ships into endless circles until they vanished from sight. In the Pacific, vast and inscrutable, canoes and caravels alike were said to chase false islands, shimmering on the horizon only to dissolve into absence. Each of these places became a warning, a geography of fear written not on maps but on memory. Mariners did not mark them in ink, they carried them in their bones. They knew when the air grew heavy, when the gulls fled, when the hush thickened. They knew the sea was about to open its hand. Though they steered carefully, though they prayed and offered, though they marked their course with utmost skill, still the vanishings came. For the sea's will was not a hazard to be avoided, but a law to be endured. And so men sailed through Bermuda, and Segelhorst, and the White Road and the phantom straits of the Indies. Some passed safely, some did not, but all knew they were sailing upon waters not wholly of this world, waters where the hush ruled, where silence itself was the sovereign, and where to vanish was not accident but destiny. So it was that men, knowing the sea could not be tamed, turned instead to ritual. If timbers and sails could not keep silence at bay, then perhaps words and gestures might. Thus the harbors of every coast grew thick with ceremonies, small and great, each one an attempt to bargain with the hush. In Spain, before a treasure fleet set forth, priests lined the quay in solemn procession. They swung censers heavy with incense, their smoke mingling with the salt wind, and sprinkled each prow with holy water. Crews knelt upon the decks as blessings were chanted, but even as they rose, some eyes lingered on the horizon with dread. For every man knew that many a fleet, no matter how fervently blessed, had still been erased. Yet the rite continued. For to sail without it was unthinkable, a defiance too bold, even for the bravest in Portugal. Captains carried charms stitched by wives and mothers, red threads sewn into sleeves, small crosses carved from driftwood, seashells polished smooth by generations. These were tucked into pockets, lashed to masts, hidden in coils of rope. If the hush called their names, at least the sea would find them clothed in memory. Sailors said it was not for survival, but for remembrance, that some trace might cling to them, even if the tide washed all else away. In the north, along the fjords, fishermen left offerings on the rocks before casting their nets. A sliver of bread, a drop of wine, a coin pressed into a crevice, all given to the unseen choir that sang beneath the dusk. They did not expect mercy, only recognition. If we must vanish, they said, let the sea at least know who we were. In the Baltic, mothers bound iron nails into the beams of boats, believing the metal would pin their sons' souls to the world. The nails rusted, the men still vanished, but the nails remained, relics of a hope too stubborn to die. Further west, in the Isles of Britain, sailors spat upon the deck before departure, muttering that the sea must taste their defiance before taking them. Others painted wide, staring eyes upon the prow, so the ship might see what the men could not. In Irish harbors, wives stood with skirts lifted to their knees, letting the tide wash against them as their husbands set sail, a silent promise that part of them would remain rooted to shore. Some rites were darker still. In Mediterranean ports, it was whispered that sacrifices were made, not of men, but of animals, doves or goats cast into the tide, their blood spreading like ink across the water. Better the sea take a lesser life, they said, than the lives of all aboard. In other places, dolls of straw and cloth were thrown from the prow, meant to deceive the silence into claiming them instead of the crew. Whether the sea was fooled, none could tell. But still the dolls were cast, year after year, for to do nothing was more terrifying than to act in vain, and in every harbor, prayers. Not only those of priests in Latin, but muttered in every tongue of Europe, Africa, Asia, and the islands, of the great oceans. Some called upon Christ, some upon old gods, some upon nameless spirits of water and wind. It mattered little which name was spoken, for the sea answered none of them. Yet the prayers continued, for they were not truly for the sea, they were for the men themselves, to give courage as they stepped into silence. Still the vanishings came. Ships disappeared with charms sewn into their sleeves, with nails in their beams, with dolls cast before them, with blessings heavy upon their decks. The ocean was unmoved. But the rituals endured, for mankind cannot meet eternity empty-handed. If they were to vanish, let it be with songs upon their lips, with offerings made with defiance shown. And thus, alongside the chronicles of disappearance, grew the chronicles of ritual, a shadow scripture of human desperation. They did not prevent loss, but they gave it meaning, wrapping the silence in cloth of memory so that absence itself might become a kind of story. For without such rites, the hush would be only void. With them it became a liturgy, a dialogue, between man and sea, unanswered but unceasing. And in that unceasing, story lived on. The sea, in the end, was not merely water stretched beneath the sky. To those who had watched it erase whole fleets, it became a presence vast and old, older than stone, older than the names of gods. Men spoke of it as judge, as scribe, as jealous king. It was said the sea kept two ledgers, one of what it gave, fish, passage trade, and one of what it took, lives, hulls, futures. And the second ledger was always heavier. No coast escaped its dominion. In the north, cliffs shook with its fury. In the south, islands trembled at its whispers. It devoured without hunger, for hunger may be satisfied, but the sea's desire was endless. To those who listened with hearts open, it was clear the sea did not simply destroy, it remembered. Every name taken, every sail vanished, every bell silenced, all were written into its hush. That was why its silence felt so heavy for it. Was not emptiness, but the weight of all memory. Sailors told of nights when the water seemed to breathe, inhaling with the tide, exhaling with the swell. In those breaths, they felt the world's beginning, as though creation itself still lingered in the lungs of the ocean. It does not forget, old captains whispered. It speaks in silence because it carries too many voices already. Vanish into such a sea was not to be erased, but to be absorbed, folded into its eternal litany. Yet this knowledge brought no comfort, for what man wishes to be remembered only as silence? Fleets left harbors with songs and banners, but returned. In nothingness, their stories written, not in words, but in absence. Cities that had depended on their return grew hollow, bells tolled unanswered, widows kept empty chairs at their tables. The ocean's memory was rich, but mankind's grief was endless. Still, there were those who dared to imagine the vanished, not as lost, but transformed. That beneath the waves lay vast halls lit by a pale glow, where the drowned walked unbroken, keeping eternal watch over treasures and timbers alike. That ghostly fleets sailed forever on seas invisible to us, there. Sails filled by winds no living man could feel. That whole cities, swallowed by tide, rang their bells still, summoning the faithful not to ruin but to another shore. But these were dreams, tender fictions to ease despair. The truer belief, feared but unspoken, was harsher, that the sea held them in silence, nameless and countless, not as living, not as dead, but as vanished. That its greatest power was not to kill, but to erase. To fold men and ships alike into its memory, without giving them back to the world. And so the ocean came to be seen as the oldest god, nameless because it needed no name, infinite because it answered no prayer. The wind might be bargained with, the stars might be read, the land might be charted, but the sea remained sovereign. Ruler of all vanishings, every sailor knew this truth as he set foot upon the deck. that to sail was to place one's name at the edge of a page. The sea might turn at any hour. Some pages were left intact, returned to shore. Others were blotted out, swallowed in ink of silence. The sea chose, and no man could say why. And so the chronicles grew, not of victories or discoveries, but of vanishings. Ships erased in calm. Weather, fleets devoured in silence, towns hearing bells that tolled from beneath the tide. All were bound by one thread, the hush, the ancient memory of the ocean. And though men told the stories, though they set them to parchment and passed them to their children, they knew in their hearts that the truer record lay not in ink, but in water. Asterisk, the sea carried that record, eternal and unbroken, a litany without end. And still it waited, watching, ready to write new names into its silence. The ending of such a tale could never come swiftly, for the sea's story is not a straight line but a circle, always folding back upon itself. And yet, as the centuries marched, a certain rhythm could be heard in the silence, as though the ocean itself were composing a hymn from all it had taken. Ghost ships drifting back with their decks in order, treasure fleets erased whole, phantom, islands glowing on the horizon, drowned bells tolling beneath the tide. All of these were verses in one endless song. Seafarers began to speak of the ocean as if it were not water, but a book too vast to read, its pages turned by tides, its letters written in foam. Each vanished ship was a word erased and then rewritten in deeper script. Each city lost two waves, was a chapter blotted out, leaving only the memory of bells as punctuation. They said that to stand upon a cliff and listen to the hush was to hear fragments of this book read aloud, but only fragments, never the whole. For the whole would crush the mind as surely as the depths crush the whole, from the Atlantic to the Baltic, from the Indian Ocean to the frozen north. The same lesson echoed, that man's dominion was small, and the sea's dominion eternal. Kings may draw borders upon maps, merchants may tally cargoes, priests may chant blessings, but the ocean recognizes none of these. It claims what it will, and it remembers what it claims. The true empire of the world is not of land or crown, but of silence, and its throne is the deep. Some few claim to glimpse its court. A pilot from the Azores swore that, in a fever upon his sickbed, he saw a procession beneath the waves, galleons, carracks, Indiamen, canoes, all sailing side by side in perfect silence, their sails pale as bone. Upon their decks stood men not dead, not alive, their faces shadowed, their eyes fixed on horizons invisible. Behind them rose towers of coral shaped like cathedrals, their bells tolling without hand, their light burning without flame. He said it was not a dream but a truth, too heavy for the waking world. He died muttering a single phrase, "They sail still." And perhaps that was the greatest terror of all, not that the vanished were gone, but that they endured, bound forever to voyages without end. Better perhaps to die upon the shore, with earth beneath the feet, than to be claimed by the sea and made into part of its eternal procession. Yet even knowing this, men went. For gold, for hunger, for curiosity, for the call of horizons they went. And the hush, patient and immense, received them. Thus the story reached the shape of its ending, though not its conclusion. For how can an ending be spoken while ships still leave their harbors, while bells still toll, while mothers still wait at windows? The ocean's song has no final note. It is sung forever, in absence and in silence. The tale of the vanished is not one tale, but all tales, repeated each age with new names. To tell it is to stand at the edge of the sea at night, hearing nothing but the soft rhythm of waves, and to know that beneath that rhythm lies the weight of centuries, fleets, cities, lives, all held in memory too vast for men. To tell it is to join the hush, to add one's own breath to its endless hymn. And so the story does not end, but flows onward as the ocean flows. Every ship that departs may yet return. Every ship that departs may yet be written into silence. The choice is not theirs. The choice is the sea's, and the sea is eternal. Then let the endings swell like the tide at moonrise, not a sudden cut, but a slow rising, a gathering of every whisper and shadow into one great surge of voice. For the sea, who has no need of endings, allows us at least the shape of one, that men may close their eyes at night with a story held against the dark. All the centuries march now within its depths. The cogs and hulks of the Baltic, their nets folded neatly, drifted beside the carracks of Portugal, their holds still heavy with spice. Spanish galleons, proud in their guilt, gleamed beside the sober Indiamen of Holland, porcelain stacked like white altars in their bellies. English colonist ships, small and desperate, whispered of bread and hunger as they slid past the husks of Viking longships, still bearing dragon prows. And further still, the canoes of the Pacific kept pace with caravels, their paddles raised in frozen rhythm, their silence as eloquent as scripture. All were gathered, all were remembered. Above them, bells tolled from drowned cities, Ease with her golden spires, Veneta with her proud markets, the phantom isles of Hebrazel and Antillia glowing faintly as though dawn burned forever upon their vanished streets. From fjords came the low chant of the drowned choirs. From the Sargasso, the rustle of ghostly convoys circling among weed and calm. Even the whirlpools sang, their spirals echoing like drums. The whole sea became a cathedral of absence, its nave filled with vanished fleets, its roof the endless sky. And the hush, that oldest language, spread itself over all. It did not erase. It enfolded. Every ship, every soul, every bell, every light became a note in its hymn. That hymn had no words. 4 words are too small. But it had rhythm, eternal as tide. Come and vanish, come and vanish, come and vanish. Yet from the land mankind still watched the horizon. Mothers lit candles, lovers kept vigil, priests intoned. Prayers merchants counted and counted again. Every generation was warned, and every generation sent its sons once more. For the hunger of horizon was as strong as the hunger of the sea. To refuse was to deny life itself. And so the procession continued. Departures like exhalations, returns like miracles. Vanishings like the sea's soft closing of a door. The story at last belongs not to parchment nor to sailors, but to thee, ocean. We can only repeat its cadences, as monks repeat a psalm, knowing the meaning lies deeper than the words. We can only say that there were ships, and that now there are none, that there were bells, and now there is silence, that there were names, and now there is hush, and if one stands upon a cliff at dusk, with the tide low and the gulls quiet, and listens long enough, the ocean may speak in its own fashion, not in words, but in a weight, in a presence, in a silence, so vast it feels like memory itself. And then one will know, none of them are gone. They sail still, they toll still. They vanish, but they are not lost. For the sea remembers, and in remembering, it keeps them. So the epic closes as it began, with water stretching to the edge of sight, with sails vanishing upon it, with silence deeper than grief. There is no ending, only continuation. The sea takes, the sea keeps, the sea waits, and mankind, helpless and unrelenting, keeps sailing into its arms. The hush endures, and the hush is eternal. Then let there be an epilogue, a final toll of the bells that do not ring, a last turning of the tide before it slips again into endless rhythm. Hear it as the sailors heard it, not in words but in cadence. The sea has no tongue, yet it speaks. The sea has no memory, yet it remembers. Its silence is the oldest scripture, and all who cross its surface become part of its hymn. Kings and beggars, merchants and pilgrims, fishermen and admirals, all are leveled in its hush. The crowns of emperors lie beside the nets of peasants, indistinguishable once the tide has written its name over them. The ocean gives, and it takes. It opens horizons, and it erases them. We write stories of its vanishings. We mark charts. We light candles in chapels, but the sea has no need of our words. It keeps its own book, written in currents and calms, in storms and stillness. The names we remember fade. The names it remembers endure. So let this tale be not an ending, but a vow to stand at the shore and listen, to hear in the hush, not emptiness, but the voices of those who went before. A vow to speak their names, though the ocean never returns them. A vow to understand that every ship setting forth is already half a memory, half a ghost, half a prayer. And if ever you walk alone by the sea at night, when the horizon is black and the air is heavy with salt, pause and let your breath fall still. In that stillness you may feel it, the vast procession moving unseen, the sails of the vanished brushing against the edge of the world. They are there. They have always been there. They will always be there, for the sea keeps them, for the sea remembers, and in its eternal hush, they sail forever.